What motive for murder would you consider the most trivial? Betrayal, jealousy, or money? Don't rush to answer. This is a tricky question. After all, a jealous person might turn out to be greedy, and an unfaithful wife may burn with jealousy herself. When in a love triangle, each person has their own motive for murder, it won't be easy for the police to figure it out. And then even a killer who no one would dare to call very smart will manage to lead the investigation for 467 days. Growing up in Amarillo, Texas, Robin knew exactly what she wanted in life, even as a child. She wanted to stay at home and take care of her children while her husband provided for the family. Her parents, both military veterans, had a happy marriage that lasted for 40 years, and she dreamed of having a similar relationship. However, things didn't go as planned because she often chose the wrong partners and avoided the good ones as if they were a danger. But above all, Robin feared being alone. She hated being alone, and she was afraid of being alone. Fortunately, thanks to her sociable nature, she got a job as a waitress in a restaurant where there was no shortage of attention from men. And so one evening in 2003, at the age of 22, Robin met a wonderful young man named Jeremy David Spielbauer. Though everyone simply called him JD, 21-year-old JD was gentle, caring, and exceptionally polite. He served in the Marine Corps and had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He also found work as a mechanic in civilian life. Needless to say, Robin fell head over heels in love with him. Just 2 months later, she joyfully announced to her parents that she and JD were expecting a child. Her parents had only just learned that she was dating someone, but they chose not to argue. Robin moved into JD's and his mother's house. After the birth of their daughter, they decided to get married. Soon, their second daughter was born. However, as is often the case, financial difficulties made life increasingly challenging for the growing family, and conflicts became inevitable. Then, to the surprise of their friends and family, the family began attending the local church about 3 times a week. There, they made new acquaintances, including a young mother of 2, Katie. The girls quickly became friends, but Robin's friend Erin House looked with suspicion upon JD's newfound religious devotion. She believed that their church attendance was a more trivial reason, a desire to see Katie more often. Unfortunately, she was right. Robin stubbornly turned a blind eye to everything until the day her husband moved in with his lover. Approximately 8 years into their marriage, Robin filed for divorce and returned to live with her parents. JD and Katie got married on November 10th, the founding day of the Marine Corps. Now, JD helped Katie raise her 2 children, but it was clear that Robin hadn't forgotten her ex-husband until she became interested in Jared. It was evident that the young man genuinely liked Robin, and her friends, especially Erin, were very happy for her. Robin at last regained her old self, rejoiced, and smiled happily, just like before. It seemed like a happy family and a cozy nest were on the horizon for the girl. But this glimmer of hope quickly dimmed one night in April 2014 when Robin got into her car and drove away, never to return home. On the morning of April 8, 2014, Robin's mother noticed her daughter was missing. She assumed that she had stayed with one of her friends, as she had done in the past, and felt somewhat irritated because she needed to go to work and didn't know who would take her grandchild to school. At that moment, it didn't even occur to her that something might have happened to her daughter. On the same day, around noon, a local businessman was driving on the highway when he turned onto Helium Road, and 3 girls ran towards him shouting, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man contacted the rescue service after the girls told him that they had seen a black Chevrolet Tahoe with a girl lying near the rear wheel. She wasn't breathing and wasn't moving. The officers who arrived at the scene concluded that the poor girl had been there for several hours and had suffered a blow to the head with a blunt object. She had no identification, wallet, or phone with her. However, the license plate of the vehicle helped identify the victim as Robin Spielbauer. Robin's parents had to break the terrible news to her daughters and her ex-husband. JD couldn't believe what had happened and couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately went to the family to support the children and his former in-laws. At the same time, the investigators were examining the crime scene. One unusual detail they noticed was the damage to the car's glass. The rear right door's glass had chips and bright pink paint marks. What did this suggest? It indicated that someone had struck the car's glass with a heavy and pink object. However, the detectives had no idea what significance this discovery would have in their investigation. Therefore, they began questioning Robin's acquaintances. Her boyfriend Jared stated that after work, he went home, played video games, and went to sleep. JD also claimed that he was at home, had 2 glasses of beer, and fell asleep. He hadn't come anywhere near Helium Road that evening and had no idea where Robin might have gone, why, or with whom. However, his phone told a completely different story. According to his text messages, he and his ex-wife were planning to meet that evening. The man had to admit that his wife had gone to her friend's place with their son. He had arranged to meet Robin at his home to discuss their children and wanted his uncle to be there in case his wife returned early. However, he forgot about the meeting and simply fell asleep on the couch after his uncle left. He woke up shortly before 10 p.m. with a strange, oppressive feeling. JD messaged his wife and his uncle, asking if everything was okay. At 10:18, he also messaged Robin, but she didn't respond. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Just a few minutes after JD called his ex-wife, Katie arrived at the house. JD's uncle, who had returned to calm his agitated nephew, confirmed that she arrived around 10:20. They talked for a bit. As JD was still feeling uneasy, the detectives noticed that JD seemed to be trying to hint at something and directly stated that he was raising many suspicions. In response, the man claimed that he had his own suspicions but didn't specify what they were. The investigators had no doubt that JD was hiding something, and as they delved into his life, they discovered what it could be. JD had been married to Robin, but he had an affair with Katie. He then divorced Robin, married Katie, and started a new affair, this time with Robin. JD claimed they maintained friendly relations for the sake of the children, but Katie suspected there was more between him and his ex-wife. JD and Katie argued nearly every day, and Robin found it amusing. She wanted Katie to take her own medicine. The 2 women fought for a man they both considered a traitor, and what made him worth fighting for remained a mystery. Robin's friend Aaron even recalled an incident in 2013 when Robin came to Katie's house to pick up the girls. Katie grabbed and pushed her down the stairs, climbed on top, and started beating her. Robin managed to push her off. When Aaron heard about this, she warned her friend not to be alone with Katie because she was one of those crazies who could kill her. 5 months after that fight, Robin was dead. The investigators, of course, spoke with Katie. She admitted not liking Robin, but claimed she never threatened her. However, she stumbled on the same issue her husband did, her own text messages, and not just 1 or 2 messages. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie sent her husband 336 angry messages. It was clear that she was furious and struggling to find a way to vent her anger. Less than an hour before the murder, she sent the following message to her husband. "My dreams of a happy family have evaporated. I won't force you to continue bearing this burden. You started it, whether you want to believe it or not. I will end it." Statements like these, in the eyes of the investigators, turned the jealous wife into a murder suspect. However, Katie had not only a motive, but also an alibi. She and her son spent the evening at her friend Savannah Guinness's house. They left around 10 p.m. and returned home at 10:20, which was confirmed by JD and his uncle. Furthermore, there was no evidence connecting her to the crime scene, at least not at that point. On the same day that investigators were interrogating Katie, the forensic expert conducted an autopsy on Robin. At the crime scene, it appeared that she had died from a severe blow to the head with a blunt object, but the autopsy revealed something more. A .22 caliber bullet had been fired into the back of the victim's head. Now the police began searching for the weapon. Robin's parents, who lived just a few houses away from Katie and JD, watched as the police conducted a search in their former son-in-law's home. The family had an entire arsenal in the house, which was quite common for Texas. However, one small detail caught a lot of attention: a pistol with a bright pink frame, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Robin. A piece of plastic had broken off the pistol. Therefore, the investigators returned to the crime scene and combed the area around where they found the car. They discovered a .22 caliber shell casing and 2 bright pink plastic fragments that obviously matched the pistol. What was particularly intriguing was that before they found the weapon, but after the murder, the investigators had browsed Katie's Facebook page and found a photo of her shooting the very same pink pistol. However, before they could realize the significance of this discovery, she deleted the photo. It seemed like Katie didn't want the police to know about the weapon. But why? Detectives took a closer look at where she was at the time of the murder. You may remember she had an alibi. She and her son spent the evening with Savannah's family and left at 10 p.m. However, Savannah told them that Katie and her son had left at 9:50 or around that time. Just 10 minutes, but they were crucial. It only takes from 3 to 5 minutes to drive from Savannah's house to Helium Road. These 10 minutes cast doubt on Katie's alibi, and her best friend was the one who brought it to light. There was more. At 10:13, Katie's phone pinged at a tower that could be considered close to both Savannah's house and the crime scene. This meant that Katie had the means, opportunity, and motive to commit the murder. The police believed they had everything they needed for an arrest. They arrested Katie in front of her 12-year-old son, Diego. By the way, as all witnesses confirmed, Katie was with her son the entire evening. Wouldn't he have noticed if his mother had stopped the car in the middle of a field, had an argument with someone, and then committed a murder? Especially since Robin had not only been shot, but also struck with a blunt object on the head. The teenager surely would have noticed. But when he was questioned, he said that all he remembered was sitting in the car with his mom and playing games on his phone while they drove around the city. Thus, on April 11, 2014, just 4 days after the murder, the investigators informed Robin's parents about the arrest. Robin's loved ones lost a daughter and a friend. But the consolation for them was that the person responsible for her death, Katie Spielbauer, was behind bars. Is the case closed? Not quite. Katie remained in jail, unable to post bail, while investigators and District Attorney James Farron built their case against her. They soon received assistance from an unexpected source. JD came to the police station and stated something he had maintained all along. He had been at home with his uncle when he received a message from Robin proposing a meetup on Helium Road. This time, JD added to his story by saying that just after 9 p.m., Katie returned home. She was in a bad mood and started an argument. JD, not wanting to fight, went to his bedroom and lay down. When he woke up, he found that his wife had left in his car. That was when a terrible feeling of dread overcame him, and he decided to check if everything was all right. JD and his uncle received responses from Katie, confirming everything was fine, but there was no response from Robin. When the detectives asked JD why he decided to tell them about this now, he explained that the thought of his wife being involved in Robin's murder was driving him insane. The investigators challenged JD's story, which contradicted phone records available to the police. JD's phone pinged at 9:23 while he was on his way to the crime scene. JD then explained that someone else had taken his phone and his car. It was Katie. She saw his messages with his lover and took his phone, his car, and went to confront Robin. But why did Katie hit the car's rear right window with a gun? The detectives were convinced that it was likely the lovers had met on Helium Road, sitting in the back seat of the car when Katie arrived. She fired her gun before JD could react, and now he was torn between his loyalty to Katie and his desire for justice for Robin. After a few more days, JD finally agreed to tell everything. JD and Robin had met on Helium Road, sitting in the car and just talking about the kids. When they noticed headlights approaching, they heard a loud knock on the window, obviously not made by a fist. JD opened the door, and it was Katie. The girls immediately started arguing. JD demanded they stop fighting and reassured Katie that they were just talking about the children. He then went to his car and drove home, convinced that Katie would follow him, but he was wrong, so he sent 2 text messages, asking if everything was okay. JD explained that he hadn't told anyone earlier because he didn't want to believe it, as he still loved Katie, but now it was all over. He filed for divorce and never visited his wife in jail, as she was going to be there for a long time unless she could prove her innocence. When investigators took on the case, it seemed simple and straightforward. It took them 4 days to link Katie to the murder. The prosecutor believed that after some time in jail, Katie would confess. However, even her husband's admission didn't help. Katie demanded a polygraph test. The police provided her with that opportunity and she took another one. She failed it miserably, but it didn't break her. She still refused to confess. Katie didn't deny her animosity towards her rival, but claimed she would never kill her or arrange someone else to commit murder. The reason lay in her tragic upbringing. Her father died when she was 2, and she buried her mother at 18. Knowing the hardships of growing up without parents, she would never do such a thing to Robin's children. All the evidence against Katie was circumstantial, and they needed something more solid. That's when a breakthrough happened. In the prosecutor's office, someone mentioned a case where smartphones could leave digital footprints when connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Katie's phone had its Wi-Fi turned off, but her son Diego's phone had it on. This meant that investigators could track Diego's every move and consequently, that of his mother that night. Since all the witnesses consistently stated that the teenager was always with his mother, Tracing Diego's phone could lead them to Katie. The prosecutor instructed his assistants to obtain this information, and it took months to do so. When the data was finally acquired, the prosecutor met with Katie. By that time, she had spent 467 days in jail awaiting trial. The prosecutor told Katie that he considered this information the final piece needed. He was confident that it would send her to prison for life, but it turned out to be the key to her freedom, allowing her to reunite with her children. She couldn't believe it, breaking down in tears due to the overwhelming emotions. She admitted that during her time in jail, she had harbored the darkest thoughts, fearing that if she were found guilty, she would have to be carried out in a body bag. She would prefer her children to believe their mother had passed away rather than having her incarcerated for murder. Suddenly, with the snap of fingers, she was free. Within hours, the case against her was closed, and she was released. A happy ending? Not quite, as if Katie was innocent. It meant that someone else got away with murder. The prosecutor publicly admitted his mistake. He realized that JD had outsmarted him simply because everyone underestimated him, believing he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate a murder. Although there was a small arsenal in his home, he chose the pink gun, which often jammed after the first shot, solely because it belonged to Katie. He could have disposed of it in the desert where it might never be found, but he brought it back home. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a car similar to his near the crime scene at approximately the time of the murder. Although the face and license plate weren't visible, investigators were convinced it was JD behind the wheel, and no car remotely resembling Katie's was seen there. But the most significant lie he told was not about the night of the murder, but his past. JD had never served in the Marine Corps or any other military branch, nor had he been to Iraq or Afghanistan. All those stories were fabrications to impress women like Katie, whose parents had military ties, something that spoke volumes about his character. The prosecutor was certain that at some point before Robin's murder, she had told JD that she had met someone else and they would no longer be lovers. Additionally, she had expressed her desire to finally receive full child support payments. JD's scheme was simple: kill Robin to get rid of her, frame Katie to eliminate her as well, and then remain financially stable while finding a younger and more agreeable girlfriend. This would solve all his problems. However, the prosecutor hesitated to press charges, and 9 months later, Robin's mother called him. It turned out JD had asked her to do him a favor and buy him a ticket to New York, claiming he needed to go there for the weekend. Presumably, he planned to flee since it was just a short distance from New York to the Canadian border. This prompted the prosecutor to take action, but an arrest doesn't equal a conviction. That's why he took another unexpected step by inviting Katie as a witness in the case. The prosecutor was confident that his earlier mistake would now help convict JD. Robin was killed with a pink gun, and either JD or Katie had to be the murderer. It was certainly not Katie. The defense argued that if Robin had been severely beaten and then shot, it pointed towards Katie as the perpetrator because both actions could have killed her, suggesting the murderer was in a state of rage. Moreover, JD couldn't have framed Katie easily because he wasn't smart enough for such a plan. If he wanted to frame his wife, he would have ensured that she had no alibi. JD could have been sentenced to death if the jury believed that the crime included a robbery because Robin's phone and wallet went missing, and later, her daughter's documents were found in JD's car. However, the jury decided that this was more likely a theft than a robbery. Therefore, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after April 20th, 2046, when he would be 63 years old. Justice was served for Robin, but her parents still felt the pain of the thought that their daughter's greatest fear came true when JD left her alone on that remote road. In January 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. The appellate court overturned JD's conviction. It turned out that 2 jurors had formed opinions about the defendant and the case before the trial, which was not allowed by the procedure. Additionally, JD had complained about the performance of his lawyers. In 2021, the court found no issues with the jury selection process. However, the case was once again sent back to the appellate court to assess JD's complaint about his attorneys. It's important to note that the appellate court did not conclude that the man was innocent, but rather that there was a procedural error. Even if JD's trial is conducted again, Katie, who currently works at a law firm, has promised to be present on behalf of Robin to ensure that justice prevails once more. Katie herself has become the director of a company that helps teenagers and adults overcome emotional and physical traumas and change their lives for the better through sports. Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police. But the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action, so she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there. With whom? The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time, the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: Gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth, but in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Pitești. But Pitești is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Pitești, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone. But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Steven. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Steven's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children, Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori. So 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Steven and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death, as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Steven, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Steven realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Steven took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, for 2 years Steven worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Steven was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women, but a woman can only have one husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Steven. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle. But she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Steven made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Steven Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula, but instead of destroying the copy, she put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything. The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home. Her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her Uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her, but Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Alinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus, in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her? But it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Olinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Selindon, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet, even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions. Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed, and the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry, As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted, introduced himself by another name, and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Mai gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Mai, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Mai left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Mai, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter and they liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country, and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story. On April 18, 2011, Jessica Bullock couldn't sit still all day. It had been a whole day since she had been able to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca or Becky Porter, whereas they usually talked every day. Jessica was particularly concerned because her mother had been complaining of feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning or something similar. Jessica urged her mother to go to the hospital, but Becky, who disliked missing work, kept putting it off. On April 17th, the last time they spoke, Becky promised her daughter she would check on herself in the morning. Yet, evening had come the next day, and there was still no word from her mother. Jessica checked with other family members, but they couldn't reach Becky either. Jessica deserves credit. She could have assumed that with Becky's husband, Russell, or Rusty, as his relatives lived nearby, there was no cause for concern. But no, she decided to check in person. Jessica got into her car and drove 45 minutes to her mother's house. She hadn't been there many times, but she immediately sensed that something was wrong. One of the doors was wide open. Lights were on inside the house, and her mother's car was parked in the driveway. Jessica approached the door and called out for her mother, but all she got in response was chilling silence. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The only illuminated house in the middle of a large plot of land, seemingly occupied but unresponsive to calls. Fearing what she might find inside, around midnight, Jessica contacted the Greene County, Missouri Rescue Service. The responding police officers thoroughly searched all the rooms and informed Jessica that there were no intruders inside. However, they couldn't calm her down because there was nobody in the house at all. Instead, they encountered a plethora of details that alarmed even the experienced officers. Disorder reigned in the bedroom. Items were strewn across the floor, including bedding, and the mattress was askew, as if someone had abruptly jumped out of bed. Becky's phone and purse containing credit cards, cash, and documents were left behind. Rusty's medications lay on the bedside table. He took them daily after his cancerous tumor removal, and he would have taken them with him if they had left. However, how could the couple have left the house if their only car, which they shared, was parked at home with the keys in the ignition? In another room, likely a home office, a tangle of cables lay on the floor. But the most alarming discoveries awaited the officers in the kitchen. First and foremost, they were almost overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. Puddles of bleach were gleaming on the floor, yet the only bleach bottle under the sink was completely full. The kitchen window was open, and the protective screen on it was torn. Finally, after circling around the house, the officers discovered scattered broken surveillance cameras. It seemed like initially they were positioned to cover maximum area around the house, but someone had walked around the house and destroyed them all. Some cables connected to these cameras ran through the walls of the house, leading to the same home office where the tangle of wires lay. When the officers returned to the room, they realized that the cameras and monitor on the floor were connected to a computer, which was conspicuously absent. This was one of the most telling pieces of evidence, especially considering that Rusty had installed the cameras quite recently. Moreover, it's not common for people to install so many cameras in the middle of a farm. Was Rusty afraid of something? All the findings suggested that the spouses weren't together at the time of their sudden disappearance. The first theory of the detectives was that perhaps Becky and Rusty became victims of a botched nighttime robbery. However, the evidence didn't support this theory. Besides the car and cash, other valuable items like the television remained untouched. Maybe Rusty got into trouble, owed money to someone, and the couple decided to disappear this way. Did one spouse do something to the other, get scared of the crime committed, and flee? Or did someone attack them in the middle of the night? At that moment, investigators were considering numerous scenarios, each worse than the other, and doubted a favorable outcome. The police began questioning friends and relatives of the couple, starting with Rusty's mother, Kay Simmons, who lived in a small house directly behind the family home. She recounted that Rusty and Becky had only been married for about a year. The newlyweds moved into the house on the 49-acre property owned by Kay's parents. Also, less than a kilometer away from the young couple, Kay's brother and Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, lived with his wife Carolyn. Rusty and Becky seemed like a very happy couple, but their relationship raised doubts among their close circle. Some were uneasy about the 12-year age gap between the spouses, and Jessica and her brother even skipped their mother's wedding. On the evening of the previous day, the 17th, Rusty's son dropped by to ask his mother for painkillers because Becky wasn't feeling well. According to Kay, Rusty behaved as usual and didn't tell his mother anything that would worry her. She also didn't hear any strange sounds later that night. But when she stepped onto the porch the next morning, she saw Becky's car. Kay was surprised because Becky was a very responsible, hard-working woman who never left for work later than 7:30. Despite her son and daughter-in-law living just a few steps away from her house, she tried not to intrude and didn't go to them, simply assuming that Becky stayed home because she was unwell. But now she was certain that something had happened to her son and daughter-in-law before the morning of the 18th. Meanwhile, detectives questioned her about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Did they have any problems? Could anyone have harbored a grudge against them? And Kay immediately thought of one person. Before marrying Rusty, Becky spent 26 years in a marriage with a church pastor. However, they decided to divorce. And according to their friends, they couldn't part amicably. The former spouses fought for a long time over ownership rights of the restaurant they had previously managed together. They had been divorced for only 4 months when Becky met her future husband online. Naturally, this piqued the interest of investigators, and on the 4th day of the investigation, they questioned the ex-husband. However, it quickly became apparent that he had no connection to Becky and Rusty's disappearance. Although their divorce was accompanied by scandals, the man continued to live his life, and he had a solid alibi for the time of the couple's disappearance. Moreover, he seemed genuinely upset about what could have happened to them. After ruling out Becky's ex-husband, the police continued to delve into the personal lives of the newlyweds. Once again, the investigators quickly uncovered something interesting. Becky had complained that she couldn't stand it anymore and things couldn't continue like this. When the police questioned her daughter Jessica about this, she said that her mother had confided in her that she and her husband had been arguing frequently lately. Of course, various negative scenarios immediately sprang to the detectives' minds, suggesting that Rusty might have done something to Becky and then fled. However, unlike Becky's family, all of Rusty's relatives and friends unanimously insisted that he sincerely loved his wife, and they had never seen him happier. He truly loved her and had changed for the better because of her. So why did the woman complain to her daughter about problems? It turned out that Becky had grievances, not against her husband, but against his family, specifically against one person. Becky's grievances were directed towards Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell. Robert lived nearby Rusty and Becky on the same 49-acre property. Kay and her brother Robert had always been very close, but he didn't like the fact that his nephew had settled on the property, which he likely considered entirely his own. He was very possessive about anything that belonged to his parents, down to the smallest details. The rift between uncle and nephew had escalated to the point where both had tried to obtain restraining orders against each other multiple times. The last time Rusty filed a complaint against his uncle was 1 or 2 weeks before the disappearance. In his statement, Rusty described how Robert, passing by the couple's house, shouted that Rusty should be careful because he wouldn't stay there for long. When investigators spoke to Robert, he didn't deny the obvious and admitted that his relationship with his nephew was strained, but he claimed that the threats were just words without meaning. Moreover, he had more reason to fear Rusty, as he was just an old man with health problems, and of course, he would never harm his nephew or his wife. Additionally, Robert had a very solid alibi. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and during the couple's disappearance, he was headed to Texas with his wife. This was confirmed by phone records for both Robert and his wife, Carolyn. With Becky's ex-husband and Rusty's uncle ruled out as suspects, investigators hit a dead end. However, another crime shook them out of it. On April 25th, a week after the couple's disappearance, police were called to the scene of a double homicide of another married couple. The second crime eerily resembled the disappearance of the Porter couple, and it also began with a call to 911. Early in the morning around 5 o'clock, a neighbor of the couple called emergency services and said he had scared off a stranger wearing a black hoodie. The person ran away down the road. When officers arrived, they found Donald and Helen Willingham murdered. They had been attacked with a knife. The similarities were striking. An unknown assailant had broken into both couples' homes. Almost nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious suspects. Furthermore, Donald was a pastor, and Becky had been married to a pastor for over 20 years. Investigators pondered whether the cases were connected, or if it was just an astonishing coincidence. Was there a serial killer roaming the county, targeting married couples? However, a breakthrough occurred in the Donald and Helen Willingham case 3 months later. A young man named Jose Huckleberry was arrested on charges of robbery. After 7 hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murders. When detectives learned his motive and the details of the attacks, they had to admit that these two cases were not linked. The situation for the investigation was not improving. All the evidence collected up to that point suggested that Rusty and Becky's disappearance was linked to some crime. But what? Now the investigators had neither a motive nor any suspects. The couple's relatives and friends did everything possible to keep the public aware of the case. They printed a huge number of flyers and posted them in all frequented places, gave interviews to local media, and of course, continued to cling to the only glimmer of hope in the realm of dark thoughts and forebodings: hope. Despite the grim circumstances, the community remained supportive, rallying around the missing couple's loved ones and assisting in any way they could. The search for Rusty and Becky continued, fueled by determination and the unwavering belief that answers would eventually surface. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a new lead emerged. A prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward with information that would interest investigators. Shortly before his arrest, he was relaxing in a bar where he met a man named Tony Friend. They struck up a conversation during which Tony boasted about several crimes he had committed. Among them was the murder of Rusty and Becky Porter. Detectives were skeptical of the informant, who naturally came forward only in hopes of striking a deal with the prosecutor. However, they were obligated to investigate. At the very least, they needed to find out who this Tony Friend was. The more they delved into the man's past, the fewer doubts remained about the informant's words. Tony Friend, 43, had a history of repeated involvement in violent attacks and armed robberies, rather than minor offenses, indicating a propensity for cruelty. However, it was only after examining his phone data that detectives believed they had a solid lead. On the night of April 17th, he was in close proximity to Rusty and Becky Porter's home. and then he headed towards the Cedar Creek area, known for its vast expanse of dense forest, although investigators didn't know exactly where. They invited him in for questioning, but it proved to be a futile exercise. Tony denied any connection to the couple, claiming he hadn't committed any crimes and had no knowledge of the matter. He didn't answer most of the questions, and those he did answer were so evasive that essentially the only thing he confirmed was his name and age. Detectives had hoped for a more fruitful outcome, but they were now convinced that they needed to dig deeper in this direction. Knowing that Tony had been near the missing couple's home before heading towards Cedar Creek, investigators decided to speak with his relatives and friends. Since Tony grew up in the area, he likely knew it well, and there could have been a secluded spot known only to his close acquaintances. They were right. Tony's cousin immediately recalled a place where they used to play as children. It was an area with dense vegetation near Cedar Creek, inaccessible by car. The kids called it the bulldozer spot because that's where old, non-functional cars were dumped. There were also dilapidated and abandoned cabins, which had been falling apart since they were children. The woman led the police to this location, and it turned out to be the piece of information they had been missing. On July 21st, the police headed to the specified location in Cedar Creek, specifically to the old cabin where Tony used to play with his friends in his childhood. Immediately, they detected a distinct smell, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. In the center of the dilapidated cabin, amidst piles of debris, they found a hole in the wooden floor. Inside, they discovered the bodies of two individuals, still dressed in their pajamas. Blood at the scene indicated that they were killed right there. The bodies had significantly decomposed, and investigators relied on dental records and DNA to confirm their identities. It was Rusty and Becky. Autopsies revealed that each of them had died from a single gunshot wound to the right temple, fired at close range. The discovery of the bodies dashed the last hopes of Becky and Russell's family to see them alive. It was even more difficult for them because they couldn't comprehend why someone would do such a thing. It was an execution-style murder. However, the investigators' task shifted from searching for bodies to finding the killer, and all circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect. The police had another ace up their sleeve. Despite Tony's hardened criminal background, modern technology played a crucial role in the investigation. Officers revisited Tony's phone data and discovered that 3 of his close associates, his wife, Wendy Friend, his son, Philip Friend, and his nephew, Dusty Hicks, had followed a similar path to Tony on the night of April 17th, the day the couple went missing. If Tony remained tight-lipped, perhaps they could pressure one of them. Investigators identified 26-year-old Philip, Tony's son, as the weakest link among the accomplices. During the period between the couple's disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, Philip had been implicated in a theft and was serving time in prison. He had already experienced incarceration, so when detectives threatened him with charges of double homicide, he agreed to talk. On December 17th, the young man revealed that his father had offered him a job to ensure that 2 individuals would never celebrate another birthday. It was criminal slang for murder, and Philip understood the gravity of the task and agreed to it. So, on April 17th, according to the boy's account, his father, Wendy, Dusty, and he got into the car and headed to Rusty and Becky's house. Wendy stayed in the car while the others put on gloves, balaclavas, taped the cuffs of their sleeves and pants with tape to not leave a single hair at the crime scene, grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution with bleach, and headed towards the family's home. They destroyed the cameras and searched the entire house for a way inside, but they were unsuccessful. They were about to leave when Dusty noticed a partially open kitchen window. They cut through the protective screen, pushed the window open, and Tony helped Dusty crawl inside. Dusty then opened the back door. The accomplices then entered the couple's bedroom. They startled Rusty and Becky awake, and Dusty and Tony pointed their weapons at them. Naturally, they were terrified, begged for mercy, and didn't understand who had burst into their home and what they wanted. But the criminals had more important matters to attend to than explaining anything to their victims. They generously poured bleach all over the kitchen floor, took the computer where the surveillance camera footage was stored, and, after tying the victims' hands with zip ties, led them to the car. It's remarkable how much effort the accomplices put in to avoid getting caught. In light of this, it's simply astonishing that Tony himself confessed his involvement in this to a stranger in a bar. Be that as it may, they dropped off Wendy at home and went to the location chosen by Tony, now known to the police. The accomplices parked the car in a field right in front of the dense forest, so vast that no one would hear a gunshot or screams. Tony instructed Dusty and Philip to wait while he led the spouses away. In their pajamas, barefoot, at gunpoint, they obediently walked into the woods. It's hard to imagine what they were feeling at that moment. Surely they understood they wouldn't be coming back, but they obediently pressed forward. According to Philip, he and Dusty sat for 10 minutes when they heard a gunshot, and it was only another 10 minutes later that the second shot rang out. The horror those 10 minutes must have been for the second victim. Tony never revealed what happened in that abandoned shack in the middle of the dense forest. There are many self-evident assumptions about this, but due to lack of evidence, they remain just that. And Philip could only talk about what he knew for sure. And according to his admission, it was only when his father emerged from the darkness of the forest alone that he began to understand what they had just done. After Philip's confession, investigators had only one question left that demanded an answer, although they already suspected the answer. Why did his father decide to kill two people he had never even met before? For this job, he was promised $100,000. And for Philip, this was no secret. It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, and his wife, Carolyn, Tony's sister. It was Robert who was the mastermind behind the murder, planning the attack for a time when he himself was supposed to be away in Texas. In fact, aside from disputes over the 49-hectare plot of land they lived on, he had a second motive. Robert was selling stolen equipment and using his property for these purposes. Rusty and Becky didn't like this, and they weren't going to stay silent about it. They raised a fuss that annoyed Robert. Becky was very afraid that unknown individuals were lurking around their home, so her husband installed cameras facing different directions from the house. Irritated by their behavior, Robert decided to get rid of them, to silence them forever. Naturally, he turned to Tony, a hardened criminal, and conveniently enough, his wife's brother. As the police learned, he approached Tony with a request to kill his nephew. Tony inquired about Becky, to which Robert coldly replied, "If she's there too, then kill her too." Tony agreed. Robert was arrested, but he stubbornly denied everything. He constantly reminded the investigators that he had an alibi. When the charges were brought against him, Tony and Dusty pleaded guilty. Tony and Dusty were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Wendy decided to try her luck in court, was found guilty, and received a similar punishment. Robert also opted for trial, which made prosecutors nervous. Except for Philip's testimony, they had nothing solid against him. However, Philip agreed to testify against him and performed well in court. It was thanks to him that Robert was convicted. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He will never see the light of day again. For his cooperation and willingness to plead guilty, Philip was sentenced to 13 years. Robert's wife, Carolyn, took her own life, unable to bear it all. She faced charges only for perjury. Arguments in people's lives are common and inevitable, and nobody really expects that a dispute will result in such consequences as murder. Becky and Rusty didn't like Robert's illegal side job, and they didn't hesitate to speak out about it directly. They knew it was dangerous. Becky openly feared the suspicious individuals who appeared near their home, and Rusty even installed a series of cameras to protect his wife. Unfortunately, it didn't save them. On that fateful night, when the couple walked into the woods in their pajamas and barefoot, did they suspect that Uncle Robert was to blame, wishing to get rid of the troublesome nephew and free up the house? Did the killer say anything to them before pulling the trigger? Or did the spouses believe to the last that it was some random attack, and the quarrels with Uncle Robert were just silly arguments, and he would never harm his nephew and his wife?
It all started right where it ended, at St. Malachy's Church in Tyrone, Northern Ireland. In December 2010, beauty queen and teacher Michaela Hart and sports star John McCrime tied the knot, sharing their celebration with over 300 guests. However, just 3 weeks later, John returned with the body of his young wife, who was buried in her pristine wedding gown. What led to Michaela's death? Who could be so heartless and calculated as to take the life of a woman who had just begun to enjoy married life with her beloved? And will the collaborative efforts of multiple countries help uncover one of the most memorable and harrowing crimes of recent years? The captain of the Irish football team, John McCrime, and the daughter of one of the country's top football managers, Michaela Hart, met at university in 2005. It was love at first sight, and since then, the young couple had never been apart. During a vacation in Paris, John proposed to Michaela, and she happily accepted. They planned their wedding for New Year's Eve, on Michaela's 27th birthday. After the ceremonial wedding, the newlyweds boarded a plane, embarking on their 3-week honeymoon. They spent the first week in Dubai before the most anticipated part of their trip began, 2 weeks at the 5-star Legends Hotel, located in the fishing village of Grand Gauba on the northeast coast of Mauritius. Michaela chose Mauritius as their paradise island for the dreamy honeymoon and carefully researched local hotels.
They settled on Legends Hotel due to its numerous positive reviews and popularity among tourists from Ireland. Upon arrival at the hotel, they asked the receptionist if they could be allocated one of their best rooms. They were informed that there was a vacant room in the luxury block, room 1025. January 10, 2011, after having breakfast together, John decided to play golf while Michaela sunbathed. They met again for lunch. Michaela always enjoyed having tea with something delicious after lunch. She asked her husband to order tea while she went to the room to get Kit Kat bars with her favorite dark chocolate, which she had brought from Dubai and kept in the refrigerator. John offered to bring the treats for her, but it was only 150 steps from the restaurant to the room, so she went by herself. John took some photos and watched videos while waiting for his wife to return. After some time, he began to wonder why Michaela hadn't come back yet. He decided to look for her. Knocking on the door, John received no response. Since he had forgotten his key in the room, he peeked through the window but couldn't see anything, so he went to the receptionist. The corridor attendant led him back to the room and opened the door with his key. However, as soon as the corridor attendant took a few steps away from the door, he heard the cries of a man asking for immediate help. Upon entering the room, John discovered his wife in the bathtub filled with cold water. Bruises were visible on her neck, her skin was icy to the touch, and her lips had turned blue. Assuming that Michaela had intended to take a bath due to back pain but slipped or lost consciousness, John attempted to help her. However, his efforts were in vain. Within an hour, medical professionals pronounced Michaela's death, bringing an end to the dreams of a young and happy married couple. Presumably, due to the initial assumption of an unfortunate accident, nobody attempted to secure the crime scene, and people constantly entered and exited the newlyweds' room. The police were initially informed that a tourist had drowned, but upon entering the room and observing the state of Michaela's body and the disorder in the room, they suspected a murder had taken place. The distraught husband was taken to the police station and held for questioning for 5 hours. This was not unusual since most murders are committed by individuals close to the victims. What was abnormal in John's case was the cruelty and inappropriateness of the statements made by the police officers. Naturally, John couldn't hide his tears over the loss of Michaela. Just half an hour earlier, he had seen his wife happily walking towards their room, but now he discovered her lifeless body in the bathtub. However, upon seeing his tears, a police officer, perhaps trying to console him, said, "Why are you crying? You're still young. You'll find yourself a new wife." It is unknown how long they would have kept John at the station if it hadn't been for the hotel manager's intervention. The manager informed the police that the door of room 1025 had been opened with a stolen master key that fit all the locks. It became evident that the murder had been committed by someone from the hotel staff. It was likely an unintentional murder. Someone among the staff, possibly a security guard with access to the master key, entered the room at 2:42 p.m. 2 minutes later, Michaela opened her own door. The thief, possibly hiding in a small niche in the bathroom, had to quickly consider his options due to the unexpected presence of the maid. If his duties involved room cleaning, he could have simply smiled at Michaela, pretended to do his job, and nothing would have happened because it's a common situation in a hotel. However, if he was a security guard, he knew that his presence in the room would not be easily explainable. So, the only option he saw for himself was to hide in the bathroom and hope that the woman would simply leave. But that didn't happen. As investigators speculated, Michaela decided to take advantage of the opportunity and entered the bathroom. Inside, she encountered the thief. Michaela got scared and ran, and the thief, in panic, attacked her. Realizing that he had killed Michaela, he placed her in the bathtub. Perhaps he tried to create the appearance of an accidental incident with the maid. Despite the shock, he may have also thought that water would wash away any DNA evidence left on his victim. When John got up from the table at 3:05 p.m. and went to check why his wife was taking so long, the killer was still in the room.
If John had his keycard with him, he could have caught the killer at the scene of the crime.
However, by the time he went to the administrator, asked for the door to be opened, and entered the room, it was already 3:26 p.m., and the thief, unintentionally turned murderer, had vanished. Releasing John put the police under immense pressure. When a tourist is killed in a country that heavily relies on tourism, it becomes crucial to quickly solve the case. It seemed like the case would be solved promptly because the local police chief stated that the island had a 100% homicide clearance rate. One might think he was just acknowledging the efforts of his subordinates, but any professional would be suspicious considering that in 2011, besides Michaela, 30 other people were killed on the island, and all cases, except Michaela's, were solved based on confessions from suspects. The following year, the police once again solved all cases based on confessions. The fact that the police excessively relied on instinct and intuition, if it can be called that, could have been compensated by the fact that the investigators had an ideal crime scene. The hotel room was clean every day. Each entry into the room was recorded by the security system. Surveillance cameras were placed everywhere, and the hotel itself was practically an impregnable fortress, with vigilant security guards everywhere. As it will become clear shortly, that was not the case at all. Within 2 days of the murder, the police arrested several hotel employees, and 2 of them, Avinash Tribhuwan and Sandeep Mania, were charged with the murder while the others reluctantly became key prosecution witnesses. A week later, a hotel security guard named Dasan Narayanan was also arrested. Dasan was on duty on the day of the murder. His exact location at the time of the crime could not be confirmed, but his fingerprints were found on a fake key that the thieves used to replace the stolen universal key in the security room. Dasan couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how his DNA ended up on the safe door in the room. He admitted to touching Michaela's cheek when he rushed to help John, offering an explanation in advance for how his DNA could be present if it was found. However, despite Dasan's conflicting statements, the police decided to charge him only with being an accomplice to the thefts, focusing their main efforts on Avinash and Sandeep. On May 22, 2012, the trial began. The prosecution built its case primarily on the confession obtained by the police, following their customary practice. Prosecutors argued that when Michaela returned to the room on that day, she caught Avinash and Sandeep stealing money from the safe or her purse. Since hotel employees are often the main breadwinners for their families, not just immediate relatives, the thieves preferred to silence Michaela to avoid losing their jobs. During the trial, their colleague Raj Thikoi also testified. He was initially arrested but became the key prosecution witness and received immunity. Raj stated that he was near the room and heard the agonized cries of a woman but didn't knock on the door. Instead, he hid and saw the agitated and sweaty Avinash and Sandeep leave the newlyweds' room. Later, he asked what had happened, and they replied, "Nothing happened, just keep quiet. If you say anything, we'll involve you in this matter." In addition to witness testimonies, the prosecutors largely relied on the confession obtained from one of the suspects, Avinash Tribhuwan, following the customary police practices. Despite the fact that Sandeep and Avinash were the accused, it created an impression that the police themselves were being judged alongside them as they conducted a careless investigation. The defense attorneys drew attention to all the evident gaps, inaccuracies, and blatant errors made by the investigators. Firstly, after the discovery of Michaela's body, the hotel was not sealed off, and not a single guest or staff member was interviewed. Some tests were not conducted, while others were only performed after the hotel room was returned to the hotel's control, compromising the evidence. Fingerprints and palm prints were found in the room, but their owners were not identified. However, no DNA evidence indicating the guilt of Sandeep and Avinash was found. Even the paper currency, which according to the prosecutors interested the thieves, was not fingerprinted or examined for DNA. The court also heard that all the crime scene photographs were taken in black and white, and many important items were not photographed at all. But the biggest uproar was caused by the mystery of the 46 surveillance cameras capturing the events inside and around the hotel. Despite numerous requests, the police did not hand over the video recordings to the defense attorneys. It turned out that they did not withhold the footage because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. 90% of the videos were erased by the police officers who were unable to operate the cameras. When asked to demonstrate how the equipment works, instead of honestly answering yes, they simply pressed the button. It happened to be the record button, and when they thought they were playing back the recordings, they were actually erasing them. The glaring incompetence of the police made international media wonder if the local authorities were deliberately sabotaging the investigation. Finally, the accused claimed that they only made confessions after being subjected to torture by the police. Dasan Narayanan, who allegedly gave Sandeep the key card, claimed that he was forced to make the confession under threat of a weapon. Avinash also denied his statements, stating that the police tortured him and interrogated him with water, after which he vomited blood. Furthermore, he was allegedly told that his wife would be deported and he would be forced to live in Ireland with John McCrime, who would now need a new spouse. Avinash stated that he didn't even read his own confession because he simply signed the document that was presented to him. Another witness stated that he was forced to give false testimony, even though he and Sandeep were actually in room 1009 at the time of the murder, where a VIP client was supposed to stay, and Sandeep insisted on his subordinate maintaining perfect cleanliness in the room. At one point, he even grabbed the mop himself and demonstrated how the floors should be cleaned. Additionally, Sandeep claimed that he was on the phone with his sister in Britain at the time of the crime, which was corroborated by telecommunications data. Finally, the preserved surveillance camera footage also confirmed that he was in a different part of the hotel at the time of the murder. Overall, the court proceedings, which were expected to last for 2 weeks, dragged on for almost 8 weeks. This was largely due to the defense attorneys crossing the boundaries of decorum and turning the trial into a show. They constantly made jokes and elicited bursts of laughter among the bored onlookers and law students present in the courtroom. The defense raised the issue of there potentially being a sexual motive for the crime, hinting at the involvement of Michaela's husband. They referred to an intimate aid they found in the hotel room and insinuated possible misconduct between John and his wife. However, it turned out to be a simple insert from a women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, which Michaela had purchased at the airport. They then attempted to prove that John and Michaela had a severe argument, presenting a video that allegedly confirmed this. However, the individuals in the video were not Michaela and John, but rather 2 people resembling them from Germany. As a result, John had to contact this man on Facebook and request him to provide a statement at a police station in Germany, confirming that he was the one in the video. Overall, Michaela's family was incredibly distressed by the sensationalism surrounding the case of her murder. In particular, a local newspaper conducted a survey titled "Who Killed Michaela?" and John ended up ranking high on the list of the readers' votes. Additionally, the Mauritian newspaper published by the police the photos of Michaela's naked and bruised body, causing indescribable anguish to her family. Nevertheless, these 8 weeks came to an end, and it was time for the jury members to make their decision. The judge summarized the case, clearly pointing out the guilt of the suspects, leading Michaela's family to believe that it would give the accused the right to demand a review of the case after a guilty verdict. They had no doubt that the verdict would be exactly as they anticipated. Furthermore, the judge strongly advised the jury not to consider the impact this case would have on the country's image, but to make the right decision from their perspective. And after 2 months of trial, deliberating for only 2 hours, the jury declared Avinash and Sandeep innocent. After the acquittal verdict, John and Michaela's families were incredibly disappointed. They endured all the agony of the process, inappropriate remarks from attorneys and police, tolerated laughter in the courtroom, and even faced aggressive behavior from the locals because they were confident that the guilty parties would be punished for the murder. They were certain of Avinash and Sandeep's guilt and believed that they were acquitted because the case received global media attention, and the jurors did not want the murder case to reflect negatively on Mauritius' image. The Hart and McCavery families cannot forget that Avinash's lawyer appeared on a local radio station and essentially admitted his client's guilt, mentioning how Avinash cried and apologized to Michaela's family. The interview was supposed to be presented in court, but the lawyer managed to evade his responsibilities. John believes that Avinash told the truth when he confessed to Michaela's murder, and here's why. When anyone hears about death by strangulation, they imagine the killer choking the victim, gripping their neck with 2 hands. But Avinash recounted that when they were in the honeymoon suite, Michaela walked in and saw him holding a wallet. She asked what he was doing. She couldn't have known that Sandeep was in the bathroom. When the girl tried to prevent Avinash from leaving the room, standing in his way, Sandeep approached her from behind and wrapped one hand around her neck. The thing is, the autopsy report was compiled much later, and it confirmed that everything happened exactly as Avinash described. How could Avinash have invented such a method of strangulation if he didn't know it for sure? Additionally, Avinash mentioned that Michaela hit her head on the floor when she fell. The bruise on the back of her head, found during the autopsy, confirmed that as well. Furthermore, in summarizing the case, the judge reminded everyone that Avinash made his confession on January 12th and signed it on the 13th in the presence of his lawyer. If the police wanted to fabricate the confession, they would have forced Avinash to sign something else on the 12th. Moreover, the boy was examined by 3 doctors on different days, and none of them found any signs of torture on him. After the acquittal verdict, a new investigation was initiated. The police focused on a crucial piece of evidence, the keycard that the thief and murderer used to enter the room. However, even the mechanism of these locks cannot be trusted. The locks are not synchronized, and each of the 240 locks in the Legends Hotel shows its own time on the security systems panel, making it impossible to determine the exact time when the killer entered Michaela's room. As a result, the alibi of practically any suspect is in question because the exact time of the crime is unknown. To make matters worse, another significant loophole was found in the hotel's guest security. This loophole could increase the number of potential suspects from dozens to hundreds. If the hotel owns the guest rooms, restaurants, bars, golf courses, and similar areas, the beach is considered public property. According to Mauritian law, the island's beaches belong to the local residents, and fishermen and traders have always had full access to both the beach and the hotel's premises. Local traders sell their crafts to tourists, and young boys are accustomed to spending time on the hotel's grounds. In other words, despite the cameras, gates, and security personnel, the hotel is unable to provide complete protection of its premises, and there is no way to verify who had access to the honeymoon suite. As a result, the new investigation into the case also ended up with no significant breakthroughs. Under international pressure, the Mauritian police revisited Michaela's murder multiple times and even enlisted the services of a French laboratory for retesting DNA samples. In 2014, there was information about a breakthrough in the case when DNA found on Michaela's clothing matched the DNA of one of the suspects. However, this discovery was insufficient to warrant a new trial. In 2017, in an attempt to draw attention back to the case, John announced a substantial reward for information about the case. A few weeks after his return home, he received a call from a lawyer informing him that the arrests of Sandeep and Avinash were now inevitable. The lawyer did not specify the new evidence that made this possible, but Michaela's family felt relieved and believed that they would finally achieve justice. However, weeks and months passed, and no one was arrested. The case was officially closed in 2020, but in 2021, under pressure from Irish politicians, the Mauritian government agreed to reopen the case. The problem lies in the fact that the willingness to re-examine the case does not guarantee that it will be solved. Investigating any murder after 10 years is challenging, let alone considering the possibility that officials in Mauritius may lack the desire to find the killers. Over the course of 10 years, many investigators have climbed the career ladder, and if something is revealed in the case that many would prefer to bury, heads will roll. After the trial, Jean and Michaela's family filed a lawsuit against the hotel for 1.6 million euros. They settled the case out of court, and the details of the agreement are not disclosed, but the money went to a foundation established in Michaela's honor. Legends Hotel was renamed Lux Hotel and continues to enjoy immense popularity, as does Room 1025, which underwent renovations and was assigned the new number 1026. John, who now works as an accountant, met a pleasant girl named Cara Brennan at a memorial dinner for Michaela in 2013. Tara, also an accountant, received a marriage proposal from John in 2015. Last year, the couple welcomed their first child, James McCavery. Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location, surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dovalibi adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dovalibis were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle, investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window, they needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family," said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guest, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Anne Dovalibi, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recall that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home, where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jacqueline Dowaliby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner, Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The DeWallabys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the DeWallaby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the DeWallabys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption. However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area." On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David Dovalibi. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game, but despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable. Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads.
The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial, especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy, who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, he couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dovalibys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not two. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dovalibys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within a mile and a half of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Siki woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court.
However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify. She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the two cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, the defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye. But that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty." Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dovalibi home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dovalibi's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt, but after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple, to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had three options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night, and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, after spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dovalibi out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, the Dovalibi family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dovalibi house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dovalibi family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation. Brent Poole took his wife's hand and surveyed the stretch of sandy beach between the Atlantic Ocean and vast dunes. They strolled slowly past private beach houses, and as they were engulfed by the darkness of the last untouched miles of forest running alongside the shore, the young man once again marveled at how romantic Myrtle Beach was. Situated between South Carolina and North Carolina, it was at the heart of the popular Grand Strand Beach. Like many tourists before him, Brent was enchanted by the rhythmic movement of the waves crashing onto the white sandy beach. Hand in hand with his beloved wife, he felt warm and joyful in his heart. Chuckling like a boy, Brent suggested to Renee, "Let's do it right here." The girl smiled and began to undress. A light breeze blowing in from the ocean cooled their naked bodies as the young couple enjoyed each other's company. After a while, Brent helped Renee get dressed, and he checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. They needed to head back to the hotel. Walking back hand in hand, they made plans for the future. In the distance, they noticed a large man dressed in black, his body covered tightly. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened them. It was the fact that the man, who was initially heading in a different direction, suddenly turned and started following them. They picked up their pace, but they couldn't shake him off. The man ran ahead and leapt in front of them. He wore a ski mask, and in his hands was a gun that he pointed at the young couple. The weapon was black and looked almost like a plastic toy. The man ordered them to lie down on the ground. "This guy is crazy," Renee thought. Brent remembered that he had an army Swiss knife in his pocket, which he bought at a flea market for Christmas. But what could he do with a knife against a gun?
The stranger demanded that they hand over all their valuables. After taking their jewelry and money, the robber aimed the gun at Brent. He pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times, but the gun refused to fire. While the robber confidently reloaded the weapon, a terrified Renee hoped that it was all just a tasteless joke and that he would leave soon. Then the man aimed the gun at Brent again. Brent begged him to spare his life. The robber smirked, glanced at Renee, and asked why he should spare him. "Because I have a daughter whom I love very much," Brent replied firmly. The shooter's eyes narrowed. He put the gun under Brent's chin and made him kneel. He pulled the trigger for the 4th time. Only this time, there was no misfire. Brent probably didn't hear the shot or feel it. But the shooter seemed unsatisfied and fired again. He wanted to make sure Brent was dead, although there was no need. The stranger turned and walked toward Renee, who lay on the sand, trembling with fear. She thought she would be the next one, but the stranger simply turned abruptly and ran toward the dunes. Renee got on her knees and called her husband's name softly through her tears. Just 10 minutes ago, they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, making plans for the future, joyfully discussing their little daughter Katie's first trip to the ocean. Renee sat by Brent, frightened and shocked. It's unclear how long she stayed in that state, but finally, she realized she needed to call for help. She remembered seeing a patrol car in the distance with her husband. With difficulty, she staggered in that direction. On June 9, 1998, shortly before midnight, Myrtle Beach patrolman Scott Brown was cruising along the deserted coastline of the Grand Strand when the headlights of his SUV suddenly caught sight of a girl frantically waving at him in the darkness. She was in a state of hysteria, and it's not surprising given what she told the patrolman. It was far beyond anything Scott was used to dealing with, like stolen wallets. But a stolen wallet was just the beginning of Renee's story. The masked stranger dressed in black had robbed them, and then he shot her husband twice in the head. The girl recounted how they obediently did everything the stranger told them, but it didn't save them. Scott, who had recently become a patrolman, was stunned upon hearing what had happened. Nonetheless, he quickly got his bearings and called for backup. On the crime scene, the arriving police officers found casings indicating that the perpetrator had used an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, which he took with him. This meant that the criminal was armed and possibly looking for another victim in the popular tourist area of the Grand Strand. The city's police, heavily reliant on tourism, could not afford another murder. They dedicated all their resources to finding the robber. The search led K9 units up to the road, but if the killer had a car, no one had seen it. Meanwhile, the police took Renee to the station, where they checked her hands for gunpowder residue as a precautionary measure. They didn't find any. The police had no reason to suspect her, but the entire scenario of what had happened was troubling. A random beach robbery was unusual in itself, but a robbery and murder on the beach was almost unheard of. The strangest part of Renee's story, from the police's perspective, was that she survived to tell it. If the robber decided to shoot his victim in the head to eliminate a potential witness, then why leave Renee alive? She wasn't even tied up, and she was not struck or gagged. Renee recounted that the gun clicked, as if there were no more bullets left. The casings found on the beach seemed to confirm her words. According to her account, it appeared that it was her lucky day. Meanwhile, the police had the difficult task of informing the parents of the 24-year-old young man that their son had been killed. Interestingly, the first thing the parents asked was whether his wife was with him. And then they revealed to the police the unusual dynamics of the marital couple. Growing up in the suburbs of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Renee always had a way with guys. She caught Brent Bullseye in a serendipitous encounter in 1991 when they met in the school parking lot. A friend of Brent asked him to give Renee a ride home, and during that ride, Brent invited her on a date. Their whirlwind romance led to the news that they would become parents in March 1995, just 3 months after Renee turned 17. Brent proposed to Renee, traditionally getting down on one knee. Both of their families were unsure if they would be able to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. Fortunately, at 21 years old, Brent already had a promising career as a mechanic, working double shifts and making a decent income for a young man. Brent and Renee even managed to buy a small house in a residential area near Winston-Salem. At first glance, it seemed like things were going well for the young couple, but after the birth of their daughter in 1996, financial problems began to arise. To overcome their financial struggles, at Brent's suggestion, Renee took up a job as an exotic dancer at a local club in the spring of the following year. Brent was proud of his wife's job, and Renee enjoyed her new lifestyle. Her new job promised to help the family forget about their financial woes, with earnings ranging from $200 to $400 per night. However, Renee brought more than just cash home from the club. She became involved with some of her female co-workers, and according to rumors circulating in the club, Brent was supportive of these relationships. It seemed that he was open to experimenting in their marriage. But one of Renee's affairs turned out to be more serious than she had anticipated. In the spring of 1998, Renee began dating John Boyd Frazier, a computer systems technician and a DJ from the club. John was a pleasant young man, known for being generous with the ladies. Rumors suggested that this aspect of him was what attracted Renee to him. As Brent spent more time with his friends and, in Renee's opinion, didn't help her enough with their child, she decided to pack her bags, take their 2-year-old daughter, and move in with John. However, just a few days after the move, Renee met with a lawyer who explained to her that given her occupation as an exotic dancer and her relatively liberal views on relationships, she was unlikely to secure full custody of her daughter. This made Renee reconsider her decision to leave her husband. Renee packed her things and returned home to her husband. Brent, who was willing to do anything to keep Renee, welcomed her back with open arms. To celebrate their reconciliation, the whole family went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. The family vacation started off wonderfully, with them all enjoying a few days basking in the sun on the beach. However, on the evening of June 9th, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Renee and Brent decided to spend the evening just the two of them. Renee had arranged for a babysitter for their daughter, Katie, at the hotel, but when the sitter arrived, their plans were almost derailed as Katie started crying. Brent tried to comfort their daughter, but Renee practically pushed him out of the hotel room. The couple visited 2 night spots, had dinner, and had a few cocktails. Then, a little after 11 o'clock, they decided to take advantage of the many secluded spots near their hotel. What happened next was known to the police. Upon learning the name of Renee's lover, the Myrtle Beach police called Salem to request an immediate visit to John's house and verify if he was there. They also spoke with Renee again. She confirmed the statements made by Brent's parents. Renee admitted that she had been involved with other men, including her affair with John, but claimed that all those affairs were in the past. However, she was uncertain if John agreed with her on this. Under pressure from the detectives, Renee admitted that she wasn't sure. By 5 a.m. on June 10th, Brent had been dead for 5 hours, and the Myrtle Beach police had a suspect in the murder, John Frazier. Detectives found out that he had called in sick to work on that day when he was supposed to be working. Unfortunately for the investigators, when they knocked on John's door, he was at home. It was almost impossible for him to travel to Myrtle Beach, commit the crime, return, change clothes, and then open the door for the police. The police had no choice but to apologize, wish him a good night, and leave. The police took up the investigation again with Renee. She came to the station accompanied by a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but one who had helped her sister in her divorce. Renee repeated her story when suddenly her lawyer interrupted the conversation. He asked to speak with his client alone, but just when the investigators thought the conversation was over, they faced an unexpected surprise. Upon returning to the interrogation room, the lawyer instructed Renee to tell everything she knew, and Renee confessed that John was the one who pulled the trigger that night. She recognized him by his voice and mannerisms. Justifying herself, she claimed that she had to convince herself first that it was him. Now the police had to find out how John ended up on a secluded beach in another city on June 9th. Fortunately, a witness appeared at the right time. Bruce Wolford, a bartender at the club where Renee worked and John's friend, heard Renee talking to John about her plans to go to Myrtle Beach with her husband for their wedding anniversary. He also mentioned seeing John attempting to fight Brent on one occasion. In John's daily planner, the police found a note under June 9th that said Renee and Brent, although it was later discovered that he simply marked all the important dates of his friends and acquaintances. John was immediately arrested, but unlike Renee, he didn't give away a single word. The investigators believed that they would get the whole story from Renee. She made a mistake when she recanted her initial testimony. She was arrested right next to the funeral home and taken in for questioning. The detective did everything possible to extract information from Renee, even if it meant deceiving her. Although John Frazier refused to speak, the detective falsely told Renee that John had confessed to killing her husband at her request. They threatened her, saying that she would never see her daughter again unless she accused John of the crime and revealed where he had hidden the weapon. Gradually, after a 2-hour interrogation, Renee's story began to change. She confessed that she knew about John's threats to kill Brent but didn't take her lover's words seriously. The next day, Renee was accused of murder, and the prosecutor decided to insist on the harshest punishment for her. Her defense attorney, who specializes in criminal cases, demanded that she withdraw her confession. The case against Renee was essentially based on the fact that John was the shooter. However, the prosecutors faced serious difficulties. Apart from Renee's confession, they had no other evidence. To prove that Renee lured her husband out of the hotel room to set up John as the shooter, they needed a witness who could link her lover to the crime scene. And they found 2 witnesses right away. 2 elderly individuals were also staying at the same hotel as the couple and coincidentally celebrating their wedding anniversary there. On the day after the murder, they contacted the police to report that they had been on the beach the previous evening and saw a man dressed in black who frightened them. They identified John from a photograph, claiming that he appeared suspicious and they remembered his face. Although this statement immediately raised many doubts because it was nighttime and the beach had limited lighting, making it unlikely for them to clearly see a man at a considerable distance. Nevertheless, the prosecutors attempted to convict Renee, hoping that her accomplice would then admit guilt. Renee's guilt hinged on what she knew about John's plan. However, if John was not the murderer, then she had no connection to the crime at all. Detectives managed to pressure the shocked girl into confessing, which became the primary evidence against her in the case. Renee lost 15 pounds during this ordeal. They desperately needed a confession to prevent tourists from fearing to visit the city. It was crucial for them to portray Brent's death as something other than a random robbery. Renee's defense attorney believes that she was convicted for her lifestyle. However, the prosecutors argued that her lifestyle had a more significant impact on Brent. Being unfaithful to her husband and working in such a profession made divorce not an option for her. It seemed more logical to get rid of Brent. Her reunion with her husband was just one step in her fatal betrayal because being with her boyfriend during her husband's murder did not play in her favor. The jury deliberated for a long time and finally found the prosecution's arguments more compelling. Kimberly Renee Poole was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial of John, who had no intention of admitting guilt, took place shortly after that. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison despite the lack of actual evidence against him. The prosecutors didn't even call Bruce Wolford to testify. If Bruce had been a reliable witness, the prosecutors would have been eager to put him on the stand and convince the jury that John was the only person with a motive to remove Brent Poole from the picture. The problem was that there were several people who liked Renee and saw her husband as an obstacle, and Bruce Wolford was at the top of that list. Darrell Wilson, a private detective hired by John Fraser's mother, thoroughly investigated the case and came to the conclusion that Bruce was just as likely a suspect as John. The former police officer spoke not only with Bruce but also with many other witnesses involved in the case. In particular, he found Chris Hensley, another witness completely ignored by the police, who had a much better view and recollection of what happened on the beach that night. Firstly, he deduced what Renee and Brent were doing on the beach after seeing Brent's unbuttoned shirt. Secondly, he encountered a man dressed in black who passed very close to him, and Chris even greeted him out of politeness. According to Chris, the composite sketch based on his description didn't resemble John at all. However, when the private detective showed Chris a computer-generated composite and pictures of Bruce, Chris stated that the man in the photo matched the composite sketch very closely based on what he remembered about the person's height, hair, and face. Even more incriminating was the fact that Bruce had installed spyware on Renee's home computer, giving him complete control over her computer. This allowed him to monitor Renee's activities for 6 months, knowing everything about her whereabouts and plans, and reading all her emails and messages. Bruce became even more suspicious given that he owned a semi-automatic pistol and had access to a white van with a number sticker on the window, similar to the one witnesses saw on the beach before the murder. By killing Brent and framing John for the crime, Bruce could eliminate 2 rivals at once. After the trial, a campaign for the review of Renee's case began. Her new attorney filed an appeal on the grounds that her predecessor had performed poorly in her duties. The court-appointed public defender only met with Renee once before the trial, and that was just to push her to agree to a 30-year sentence in exchange for confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors implanted in the minds of the jury the idea that there was no robbery at all because approximately a month after the murder, Brent's wallet was found in the yard of a nearby house with $9 in cash, Brent's driver's license, and a bank card he used to pay for dinner at a restaurant. However, the defense attorney could easily prove that $50 were missing from Brent's wallet, which he had withdrawn from an ATM on the night of the murder to pay the babysitter. Moreover, the babysitter's testimony about Renee's alleged haste was misinterpreted. The babysitter could only sit with the child from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., and she got lost, took some time to find the right hotel, and was 15 minutes late. Therefore, Renee was in a hurry to go for a walk with her husband just to spend more time with him within the 3-hour time frame allocated for babysitting. These are not all the facts that were not presented by the defense at the trial. In particular, there were electronic emails confirming that it was Brent who suggested going to Myrtle Beach. So, it wasn't Renee who lured her husband to a secluded beach. It was Brent who wanted to add some excitement to their intimate life, which is why they bought a beach towel on the way back from the restaurant at 10:52 p.m. Since they were supposed to go back home the next day, it was their last evening when Brent's desire could be fulfilled. Everything happened spontaneously. If it was premeditated, Renee would have taken a small towel with her to ensure nothing hindered the execution of her plan. Moreover, if the murder was planned, it would have been more logical for Renee to keep her husband in a secluded, wooded area until her accomplice arrived. However, the crime occurred as they were returning to the hotel. When they noticed a stranger following them, they hurried their pace. Brent even had time to draw his knife and potentially alter the situation in his favor. The Brent family has initiated an investigation along this path, claiming that Renee is responsible for everything. They have turned against her, blaming her for the moral choices their son made and desired. Renee's attorney should emphasize that Brent himself wanted her to work as a stripper and engage in relationships with other people, undermining the prosecution's theory. As Renee continues to fight for what is called mitigation of punishment after the verdict, she serves her sentence in prison. Brent's parents have been granted custody of Katie, although Renee managed to build a healthy and loving relationship with her daughter. In prison, Renee creates Braille textbooks for blind children, and her colleagues and supervisors highly value her work. To this day, she maintains her claim of innocence and insists that she does not know who robbed them with Brent and shot her husband. On the evening of Friday, April 20th, 2012, the Solis family had a very pleasant time. Rebecca and Sergio's 2 sons played a baseball game in which their 6-year-old sister, young Isabelle, was present. The game lasted until 10 o'clock,
after which the family returned home. The next morning, the girl was supposed to play baseball and Rebecca braided her hair so as not to waste time before work. At 11 o'clock, Sergio wished his daughter good night and left. Although Isabelle had her own bedroom, she often slept in her brother's room. But on this particular night, she stayed alone. Soon, Becky and the boys went to sleep, and Sergio fell asleep on the couch, watching a baseball game he had recorded earlier. At 5 o'clock, the man woke up and slowly made his way to the bedroom. The house was quiet and peaceful when he went to sleep next to his wife. 2 hours later, Rebecca left for work at the medical center. The woman didn't notice anything strange in the house and didn't hear anything. She didn't go into her daughter's room before leaving for work. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Sergio went to wake his daughter up to go to the game, but Isabelle was not in her bed. He asked his sons if they had seen their sister, but nobody responded. Together with the boys, he searched the house and called for Isabelle, but there was no answer. Then, Sergio Jr., who was 14 years old at the time, noticed that the window in his sister's room was wide open and the protective screen was lying on the ground in the yard. The husband called his wife. While Rebecca was racing home and the sons were frantically searching the neighborhood for their younger sister, Sergio called the rescue service. This was the call that later sparked a lot of controversy and criticism towards him. People react differently in a state of stress or panic, but Sergio was surprisingly calm and collected during the call. Besides his calmness, it seemed strange to many that he immediately stated that his daughter had been kidnapped. He even laughed when he mentioned telling his wife to come home. Later, Sergio explained that he was simply trying to remain calm to provide the police with all the information they needed. Interestingly, the neighbor also called 911 on behalf of Sergio Jr. Unlike his father, he was shaking and clearly upset, but he also immediately stated that his sister had been kidnapped and they wouldn't find her. Then the phone was handed over to Rebecca, who had also been in a panic and despair when she arrived home. She was able to give a precise description of the clothing that her daughter was wearing before her disappearance. The arriving officers indeed found a protective screen on the bedroom window of the girl on the ground in the yard. There was a large hole in it, as if someone had used a tool to make it. Soft toys were always lying under the girl's window in the room, and now they were scattered in disorder. Blood was discovered on the floor next to Isabelle. Shoe prints were found behind the house, on the alley and on the electrical box under the high fence of the family. Presumably, the perpetrator climbed over it when he abducted the girl. The police organized massive searches, going from door to door, believing it was a kidnapping case, rejecting the idea that the 6-year-old girl could have run away. The neighbor of the Celis family, Alicia Stardavant, said that she was woken up by a noise around 6:30 a.m. Her bedroom is literally across the fence from the girl's room. The girl said that she heard her dogs and the Celis family dogs barking. Besides them, she heard men's voices, seemingly on her side of the fence, not at the Celis family's home. But it was already getting light outside, and she didn't pay attention to it and fell asleep again. Alicia noted that the men did not lower their voices or whisper, and she didn't think for a second that there was also a small child there. The police set up a checkpoint around the Celis family's house and only allowed local residents through. The search initially focused on a small area around the house because in most cases, children are killed within a radius of 100 meters from the place of abduction. Then they expanded the search radius, included several apartment buildings, and interviewed residents. Officers checked the stadium where Isabelle's baseball game was supposed to take place, the local garbage dump. The lakes and ponds were inspected with underwater cameras and sonars. Forensic experts and search dogs searched the Celis family's home, and border guards distributed photos of Isabelle because when children go missing in Arizona, there is a high chance they end up on the other side of the border with Mexico. In addition, in 2012, 16 criminals who had committed violent acts against women and children lived near the family's home. All of them were interrogated and excluded at that time.
A theory emerged that someone had noticed Isabelle playing with her brothers in the evening, followed the family, and abducted the girl from the house at night. Following this lead, officers checked the registration numbers of all the cars in the parking lot. Surveillance video cameras located near the family's home showed an unusually active nightlife. At 2:36 a.m., a private security company's car appeared in the alley near the house, and 2 more cars were shown in the parking lot 10 minutes later. Suddenly, a large number of pedestrians were wandering around the house, some of them interested in garbage cans, and an hour before the 911 call, a car quickly turned the corner near the trash can. But the girl did not appear anywhere in the 10 hours of filming. However, something interesting was discovered during the search of the house by the police. The officers found inscriptions on the door frame of Isabelle's wardrobe. The inscriptions were written in a child's handwriting and included such words as bad father, I don't love father, and bad day. Rebecca claimed she had no idea about this, but the police decided to interrogate Isabelle's family more thoroughly. One of the sons revealed that when their father drank, he became aggressive, cursed, and hit him twice. Therefore, investigators invited employees of the Child Protection Services concerned about the Solis sons, especially since, as it turned out, Child Protection Services had been called to the family's home more than once. In January 2012, one of the boys was washing dishes and left a glass in the detergent. Sergio drank water from that glass and scolded his son for his mistake. Rebecca insists that they laughed about the incident. But the next day, the boy told his friends about it, and someone's parents contacted the Child Protection Services. Anyway, in May 2012, at their request, Sergio voluntarily left the house, although Rebecca claimed that her husband was an excellent father and when Isabelle returned home, all questions would be answered. Although the incident was soon resolved, and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and sons, the family was upset that the investigation did not bring any results. Although the incident was soon resolved and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and children, the family was upset that the police continued to focus on them, especially Sergio, despite never being named a suspect. Later, the man stated, "It feels like the investigation never went beyond this house. That's what's so upsetting." So they hired private detective Jerry Snyder to conduct an unbiased investigation into Isabelle's abduction. And his suspicions fell on Rebecca's cousin, Justin Mastromarino. At first, Justin acted as a representative of the family, constantly speaking to journalists and giving interviews. But within 2 weeks of Isabelle's disappearance, he sent his car to Florida, hired the best lawyer, and left, refusing to answer reporters or police's questions. Such behavior seemed strange to the private detective. Moreover, Justin had lived in the Solis family's home for a long time and still had a key to the house. There was a version that Justin, who had previously stayed overnight in Isabelle's room, could owe money to someone and the criminal came for him. But instead of Justin, he found Isabelle in the room and took her for ransom or as leverage. On the other hand, his friend Sebastian Hartsfield is confident that Mastromarino did the right thing, and if he had the means, he would have left too. The thing is, Justin was tired of the intrusive attention of the media and the public. Sebastian said that they spent the evening of the abduction together with Justin. He reluctantly admits that it was April 20th, National Cannabis Day, so he and Justin smoked and drank all evening. Although there was a 6-hour gap when they were asleep, and he cannot say for sure where Justin was, Sebastian is confident in his friend's innocence. When the police finally questioned Justin, the police chief said that the investigator hired by the family had no evidence, but the police were absolutely sure of Justin's innocence. It is worth noting that Sergio was also suspected of owing money to bad people, and his daughter was kidnapped for ransom. Isabelle was at the age when children are more often abducted by relatives. She was kidnapped from the house where only her relatives were present, and Sergio was the last person to see her, kissing her goodnight at 11 o'clock. He did not pass a polygraph test. Moreover,
The fact that the dogs barked at night indirectly confirms the involvement of someone from the family. How could a stranger know where the girl's room was, that she wouldn't be sleeping in her brother's bedroom, and that there would be no dogs in her room? Usually, at least one of them slept in her bedroom. How could the kidnapper know exactly how to avoid the surveillance cameras located on the street? Yet, besides suspicion, there was nothing linking Sergio or Justin to the crime. Where was Isabelle? Let's go back to the morning of July 23, 2012, when the rescue service received 3 distress calls. A child, a girl, called and said she wanted to report a kidnapping. She mentioned Isabelle's name and said he's coming, identified the district where she was located, and then the call disconnected. The officers went to the specified district, but they didn't find anyone. They traced the call to an apartment building where 2 sisters, aged 9 and 11, lived. The sisters had simply decided to play a prank. The calls caused a lot of fuss, but they were quickly released. However, their joke cost the city $4,700 in officers' wages spent on the search in the district specified by the girls. After this incident, the police tried several times to draw attention to the case, for example, by sharing an image of what Isabelle might look like several years later. But despite all efforts, there was no progress in the case for years. Who kidnapped Isabelle? Was it someone unknown to the family who entered through a window and took her? Did Justin consider kidnapping Isabelle because he was in debt and wanted to demand a ransom, but the kidnapping went wrong? Was one of her brothers involved in what happened to her, and are their relatives covering it up? Or does Isabelle's biological father know more than he's saying? Unexpectedly, on February 8, 2017, there was a breakthrough in the case. A woman named Melissa contacted the FBI and stated that they should speak to her fiancé, Christopher Clements, about the disappearance of Isabelle. Supposedly, he might know something about the girl's disappearance, but Melissa couldn't say anything more and they should talk to him. Finding Christopher proved to be quite easy. He was in jail on charges of robbery. Christopher confirmed to the agents that he knew where to find Isabelle, but demanded a deal. In exchange for information about Isabelle's whereabouts, he wants his charges dropped, his confiscated Acura Honda returned, and full immunity in Isabelle's case. He assured them that he only knows what happened to the girl. It is also known to a member of the Celis family. He hinted that Sergio knew about the kidnapping of his daughter and was involved in it. Christopher told them that Sergio was seen handing over Mexican gold coins to someone at a local pawn shop. Supposedly, there was a fight and Isabelle was taken to get the money that her father owed for the stolen coins. Christopher spoke very broadly, and no matter how much the agents questioned him, he didn't go into details. The man stood his ground, information in exchange for a deal. He got what he wanted. The prosecutor's office went for a deal, dropped the charges of robbery and returned the car. The man revealed where to find Isabelle, and on March 3, 2017, the police and the FBI found her remains. Rebecca and Sergio Solis faced the grim confirmation that Isabelle had left forever. Whatever dreams they had of a happy reunion were destroyed. However, the deal did not give Christopher Clements the desired freedom. Instead, he was transferred to the Maricopa County Jail, where he was charged with another robbery. The agreement did not provide full immunity, which Christopher insisted on in Isabelle's case. Investigators began digging deeper into the man's past. He started his criminal career at the age of 16 by committing first-degree violence. Since then, he had repeatedly gotten into trouble. The man's ex-wife said that Christopher was obsessed with adult movies, often brought girls from strip clubs home, and she was forced to sleep in the car until they left. And at the time of Isabelle's disappearance, he worked at a shopping center only 2 kilometers away from her home. Undoubtedly, detectives checked Sergio's connection to the nearby pawn shop mentioned by Christopher. They found out that 21 gold coins were stolen from the woman's house 2 months before Isabelle's abduction, and they believed that Christopher committed the theft. The surveillance camera captured him entering the pawn shop hours after the theft, delivering the goods, and receiving the money. The video did not suggest Sergio's involvement or any connection to the case. Most likely, Christopher was just studying the accusations against Sergio, which were mentioned in the press, and was talking to agents, trying to cast a shadow on the girl's father. The police received several search warrants, including one for the house where Christopher and his fiancée Melissa used to live. In one corner of the yard, investigators found a sheet of plywood under which was a plastic container containing ashes and several gruesome discoveries, including a faded lilac child's hoodie with a hood and a school assignment of a very young child with the name Mercedes on it. Her full name was Isabelle Mercedes Celis. They also found indecent photos of girls aged 3 to 13 on Christopher's devices. Searches on his computer included Isabelle Celis, unsolved cases in Arizona, and child killer acquitted. A former acquaintance of Christopher's said he talked about the Isabelle case and let slip that there might be evidence in the trunk of his car, so it was crucial to bring it back. The car was described as a Honda Acura that was returned to the man in exchange for information about Isabelle's whereabouts. It is still unknown how Isabelle died, but according to the same acquaintance, she was suffocated and her body was doused with chemicals. The man remembered that Christopher showed him photos of the Celis house that he had hidden in a Bible in his room. Investigators obtained a warrant for this Bible and indeed found pictures of the house. 2 months later, the Tucson police chief announced that they had a suspect, 36-year-old Christopher Clements, who had been charged with not 1, but 2 murders. The thing is, on March 3, 2017, when Christopher described to agents the location where they would find Isabelle, he mentioned an important marker, a pile of tires that clearly did not appear there in just 1 day. This instruction immediately alarmed the agents, because a few years ago, the police found the body of a teenage girl from Tucson near that same tire pile. The girl's name was Maribel Gonzalez. In June 2014, 2 years had passed since Isabelle's disappearance, when a rescue service dispatcher answered a horrifying call. A woman reported a body she had noticed by the roadside. The police who arrived on the call found signs that someone had been dragged on the ground, the smell of decay, and a naked body buried under the pile of tires. It was a location significantly distant from the nearest houses. The police shared with the media a photo of a chain with an anchor that the girl was wearing, as well as a tattoo on her collarbone, in hopes that the public would help identify her. Indeed, several people called the police saying that it was 13-year-old Maribel Gonzalez. Maribel's family said that she was seeing a 20-year-old man named Mariano. They had been together for 3 years but broke up a month before Maribel disappeared. Mariano told the police that she sent him a message around 11 to 12 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, asking him to pick her up because she had a fight with her mother. He ignored her message because he had to get up early for work. He never saw her again. Her boyfriend said that she loved to walk alone, even at night. She also liked to go to the mall, the same one near Isabelle's house where Christopher Clements worked. The police linked these cases based on the fact that the bodies were found in close proximity to each other. Christopher's DNA was compared to the DNA found on Maribel, and it matched. Isabelle was kidnapped and killed 2 years before Maribel. Could the perpetrator have been caught after the first crime and prevented Maribel's death? It turns out that Christopher's name came up during the investigation before his conversation with the agents in 2018, more than once. As it is already known, the officers contacted all individuals who committed sexual crimes and lived nearby Isabelle, violent acts against women and children. The list contained 16 names, including Christopher. He was listed as a Class 3 offender, meaning with a very high likelihood of reoffending. The police talked to him, but obviously, he was able to convince the officer that he had nothing to do with the case. Perhaps his girlfriend provided him with an alibi. Furthermore, after Isabelle's disappearance, her parents asked to recall any unexpected meetings, uninvited guests, traders, advertising agents, distributors, anyone who could arouse suspicion. Rebecca immediately remembered the man who was interested in their red Acura. He came twice, but the woman did not know his name, and he never entered the house. Interestingly, Christopher also mentioned that meeting during the interrogations. This is what he told FBI agents on February 10, 2017. According to him, two people pretended to be interested in the car. In fact, they needed to make sure that Sergio lived at that address. They approached Rebecca, and she gave them the phone number and said that they needed to talk about the possibility of buying from her husband Sergio. Thus, the men confirmed what they wanted. Christopher said that he just knew about this visit, but he himself never approached the Solisev's house. However, during the conversation, he several times referred to we instead of they, as if confessing that one of the men was him. Christopher's description of the visit coincides with Rebecca's story, except for one detail. The woman described only one man who matched Christopher's description and drove the same car as he did. But her description differs slightly from the description given by her husband. What if the police had followed this lead immediately after Isabelle's disappearance? Would it have led them to Christopher Clements? Investigators believe that the kidnapping of Isabelle was not spontaneous. Christopher had planned his crimes. He repeatedly called the home of the woman from whom he stole gold coins when she was not home. He also called the Celis family home as early as October 2011. The day after the kidnapping, Christopher changed his phone number and washed his car. If cleaning his car usually cost him around $10, $35, this time he paid $110. However, changing his phone number did not help, as phone records linked Christopher to two crimes. Footprints found at the scene of Isabelle's kidnapping matched sneakers that no one in the Celis family wore, but which Christopher was often seen wearing and even photographed in. Detectives also studied photos on his devices and found a miniature snapshot. It was a selfie of a man on the front seat of a car who looked like Clements, and a little girl lying on the back seat who was extremely similar to Isabelle. The photo was shown to Sergio and Rebecca. The woman agreed that the girl resembled Isabelle, but she could not say for sure because the image quality was terrible. Christopher claimed the child in the photo was his son. But when the photo was shown to Melissa, his fiancée, she began to shake. She did not recognize the child as her own. The child in the photo did not resemble the 1.5-year-old fair-haired boy. Instead, it was more like a dark-haired girl with her hair braided, which Isabelle's mother had done just before the kidnapping. The defense argued that the footprints were initially described as work boots. Christopher did not have his phone with him during those calls, and the blood in Isabelle's bedroom probably appeared before the kidnapping. Christopher's lawyers successfully pushed for two separate trials, one for the Isabelle case and one for the Maribel case, so that the prosecutor could not present evidence for both crimes at once. However, this did not help him much because he had already been found guilty of Maribel Gonzalez's murder. He still has to face trial for the kidnapping of Isabelle. When the body of a teenage girl was found murdered, the tiny town of Wasau in Wisconsin was gripped by fear. Everyone worried they might be the next victim of the ruthless intruder. But if the motive was money, why didn't he take it? The stories of the suspects only puzzled the detectives further. They wondered, was this merely a show to conceal what was really happening behind closed doors? Or was it genuine grief over the loss of a loved one? Until they found a startling clue that could put the final nail in the killer's coffin. Saturday, May 2, 2009, began like any other day for the emergency services in the quiet town of Wasau, Wisconsin. Although it was expected to be an uneventful day, a call came in at 1:30 p.m. A woman reported that her neighbor had asked her to call an ambulance for his brother's girlfriend. She was lying on the floor of their apartment with a throat wound and cuts all over her body. The police officers dispatched to the scene hoped the woman was mistaken, as the situation often turns out to be less severe than the caller describes. But not this time. Several people were waiting for the officers in the parking lot of the apartment complex. One of them stepped forward and led them to the apartment. It was 19-year-old Hugo Ramirez. The young man could barely form sentences due to how much he was crying and shaking. Hugo was about to show the detectives what had shocked him so much. The officers would not soon forget this scene either. Entering the apartment, they walked through an unremarkable living room and kitchen and approached a small hallway.
Hugo pointed to the bedroom at the very end on the left. Even before stepping into the room, the officers were stunned by the sight that met their eyes. The drying blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the belongings, and of course, on the girl lying in the center of this bloody scene. Hugo informed them that the girl's name was Brianna Schneller. Brianna lay on her back, her mutilated face covered with a towel. There were deep wounds on her neck and across the upper part of her torso. Cuts on her arms indicated that she had fought for her life, but the killer had overpowered her. Now the police needed to hurry. Journalists were already surrounding the crime scene, and it was crucial that Brianna's loved ones did not learn of her death from the news. By the time the officers contacted the Schneller family, they already knew something had happened at the apartment where the girl lived and that someone had died. But they didn't know that Brianna was the victim. Her parents had been trying to reach her without success. They were informed of the news at the station. Afterward, they were asked to identify Brianna from photographs taken at the crime scene. Even after confirming it was her, her parents, Craig and Lori, and her brother Rocky, still couldn't believe what had happened. Despite their unspeakable sorrow, the family members tried to provide the police with as much information as possible about Brianna and the details of her life leading up to the murder. Craig and Lori explained that Brianna's life was much like that of her peers. She was finishing school, working part-time as a waitress in a restaurant, and enjoyed spending her free time with friends. She loved shopping, dancing, and music. Moreover, Brianna was looking forward to a trip to Tennessee that summer, where she was to present an important project for a renowned non-profit national organization of professional and technical student leaders. Brianna was the only person in the entire state of Wisconsin who met all the criteria to participate in this event. To the family, what had happened made no sense. As Craig explained, she didn't have a single enemy. Her relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Sebastian Ramirez, Hugo's brother, was wonderful. The couple had met a couple of years ago and had been inseparable since. During this time, the parents had gotten to know the young man well. Naturally, they had concerns when Brianna decided to move in with him at 18. They worried that she was growing up too fast. But Sebastian truly loved their daughter, so they accepted her decision. After high school, she planned to pursue higher education in restaurant management and dreamed of opening a restaurant with Sebastian. She genuinely enjoyed working in the restaurant business, and she was loved by her colleagues and customers. The girl's parents also helped the police narrow down the time frame of the attack on Brianna. Her mother, Lori, was the last person to speak with Brianna a few hours before the body was discovered. That day, Lori had taken her daughter's car to the auto shop to fix the brakes and had texted her daughter at 10 a.m. Thus, the attack occurred sometime after Lori spoke with her daughter at 10 a.m. and before Hugo found her at 1:30 p.m. While the detectives were speaking with the girl's parents, forensic experts found several clues at the crime scene. First of all, an iron lying on the floor near Brianna caught their attention. Various parts of it were scattered on the floor, and there was blood on the iron, suggesting the killer might have used it as a weapon. In the bathroom sink were 2 knives, one of which was missing its sharp tip. Blood was found on a bar of soap nearby, indicating that the killer had taken the time to wash the knives and their hands, but had missed leaving a bloody shoe print on the mat. Further examination of the apartment revealed 2 more interesting points. First, there were no signs of forced entry, and second, nothing seemed to be missing. This was especially curious because cash was scattered throughout the apartment. Various bills ranging from $1 to $20 added up to a considerable sum. If a robber had broken in for money, they would have taken it. Thus, the evidence at the crime scene indicated that Brianna herself was the target of the attack. The autopsy confirmed this conclusion. The most crucial information the medical examiner shared with the detectives was that the girl had fought for her life, and the killer's DNA likely remained under her nails. Skin samples found under her nails were sent for analysis. Overall, the autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality and the attacker's fury. Brianna had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely the iron found near her body. The attacker also slashed her throat with a knife and inflicted so many stab wounds that the pathologist couldn't accurately count them.
The knife wounds were particularly severe, and at least 2 of them were fatal enough to kill her within a minute. The tip of one of the knives found in the sink was discovered in one of her wounds. Usually, such a savage attack indicates that the killer must have felt uncontrollable rage towards the victim to inflict so many injuries. But who could have harbored such strong feelings toward Brianna? The police knew of at least one person they needed to speak with immediately. Sebastian was brought to the station along with his brother, but they were placed in separate interrogation rooms so their statements could be compared later. Sebastian explained that he woke up around 9:15 a.m., an hour before he was due at the Mexican restaurant where he and his brother worked. The restaurant, El Tequila Salsa, was about 3 kilometers from the apartment, a 10-minute drive. The young man took a shower and chatted with Brianna, as she didn't need to go to school on Saturdays. Hugo had overslept, so his brother had to wake him up just before leaving the house at 10 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., Sebastian was already at work and was there when he received the call informing him about what had happened to his girlfriend. Hugo's story began much like his brother's version. After being woken up by his brother, he quickly got ready and left the house 15 minutes after Sebastian. Nothing unusual happened at work. At 1:20 p.m., Hugo went on a break and drove home to take a short nap. Entering the apartment, he initially didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked down the hallway and into his room, but he soon felt uncomfortable as if something was wrong. That's when he noticed that Sebastian's room door was open. Hugo peeked inside and to his horror saw Brianna lying on the floor. Rushing over, Hugo started shouting her name, begging her to get up, to wake up, but she didn't respond. Only then did he notice how much blood there was in the room. He tried to dial 911, but his mind suddenly stopped working and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even press the buttons. He then ran downstairs, where through his panic he tried to explain to a neighbor that they needed to call for help. The young men seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened. Investigators wanted to believe them, but they knew they needed evidence to confirm their innocence. It was possible they were simply excellent actors, or were hiding remorse beneath a mask of grief and pain. Since both brothers' stories were identical, detectives considered the possibility that one of them committed the crime and the other was covering for him. In such a scenario, Sebastian seemed to have a potential motive to kill Brianna. Officers questioned the brothers about their relationship with Brianna, whether there were any issues, quarrels, or jealousy. Sebastian categorically denied any problems and stuck to his story. Brianna was the love of his life, and they were looking forward to a happy future together. Hugo was questioned with even greater scrutiny, especially after it was revealed he was supposed to work until 3 p.m. that day, but had changed his break time with a colleague due to a hangover, wanting to go home and rest. Detectives wanted to know if anything had happened between him and Brianna. Were there arguments? Perhaps Hugo also had romantic feelings for her, but Sebastian proved to be a more successful rival. However, Hugo vehemently denied this. Brianna was like a sister to him. He knew how deeply she and Sebastian loved each other, and he would never stand in their way. These interrogations continued for hours, but no matter what the police asked, Hugo and Sebastian stood by their stories. However, the brothers were able to clarify the issue of the scattered money found throughout the apartment. It was Hugo's tips. Previously, he used to carefully count all the money, but lately he had become lazy. When he came home, he simply emptied his pockets wherever, always promising himself to deal with it later. After obtaining DNA samples from the brothers, they were released, but in the eyes of the detectives, they remained the only suspects in Brianna's murder. Therefore, their next task was to either confirm or disprove the brothers' testimonies. Colleagues from the Mexican restaurant El Tequila Salsa confirmed that the young men were at work. Moreover, the restaurant had surveillance cameras, including ones that recorded the kitchen area. After reviewing the footage, the police confirmed that Sebastian arrived at work first at 10:13 a.m. and did not leave until after Brianna's body was discovered. Hugo arrived at work a few minutes later and took his break at 1:20 p.m., just as he had stated. At the same time, the detectives were following another lead. Their conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the apartment had been hasty. Although the money and valuables were indeed left behind, the police had not found Brianna's phone. Like any teenage girl, Brianna always kept her phone with her. Moreover, she had exchanged messages with her mother at 10 a.m., so she definitely had it with her before the murder. This greatly interested the police, as the phone could contain something crucial to solving her murder. Therefore, the detectives made finding the phone their priority. They contacted Brianna's service provider, The phone company pinged the device and not only found that it was on, but also pinpointed its exact location. The detectives took one look at the address and were stunned. They knew this place. More than that, they had just been there. The phone was located near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant where the brothers Sebastian and Hugo worked. The detectives rushed to the location to find and seize the device as quickly as possible. Upon arrival, they realized that the coordinates were not for the restaurant itself, but for the parking lot of the shopping center where the restaurant was located. The police soon narrowed down the search area to the section where the dumpsters were. The detectives were reluctant to sift through all the garbage bags and had a simple yet brilliant idea. They called the phone, opening the dumpsters one by one. Finally, they heard the ringtone. Carefully moving the contents of the dumpster, the officers saw a light-colored bag through which the phone's screen light was visible. The bag contained several items, not just the phone. The police were eager to open it but had to send it to the lab first because it could have DNA on it, especially on the top where someone had carefully twisted it closed. However, the detectives could already make one conclusion. This was not an ordinary bag, but a bag with the logo of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, which customers used for takeout orders. The circle around the brothers was tightening more and more. Of course, they seemed to have an alibi, but the investigators couldn't believe that anyone else had committed the murder. Moreover, the pathologist couldn't determine the exact time of the girl's death to the minute. What if the crime happened a little earlier than they assumed? The girl had communicated with her mother at 10 a.m. Immediately after that, one of the brothers, or even both, killed Brianna, quickly got ready, and showed up at work at 10:15 a.m. Then they threw the bag with the evidence into the trash bin near the restaurant, hoping no one would find it. After the forensic experts collected DNA samples from the bag, it could finally be opened. Inside, in addition to Brianna's phone, there were warm gloves, but from different pairs, with one of them stained with blood, and also women's underwear, 2 pairs of panties. The investigators had expected anything, but not this. They had more questions than answers. According to Sebastian, the underwear belonged to Brianna. One of the gloves likely had been taken from the apartment as well. However, these items contradicted all the theories the detectives had been considering. If Hugo or Sebastian had committed the crime, it would be absurd for them to take the girl's underwear. But Sebastian and Hugo did not kill the girl. After examining Brianna's phone, investigators saw that her last conversation was not with her mother, but with a friend. Brianna sent her last message at 10:23, when the brothers had already definitely arrived at the restaurant, as confirmed by surveillance cameras. The entire investigation turned upside down. The police had never considered any other suspects besides the Ramirez brothers, but it turned out that both were completely innocent. So, who was the killer? And why did they dispose of the bag with evidence right near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant? Now, the detectives had to add a multitude of names to their list of suspects, employees and patrons of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant. They considered it highly unlikely that someone unrelated to the restaurant killed Brianna, collected incriminating evidence, and disposed of it right near the restaurant. Therefore, they first reviewed the list of employees, and one name caught their attention: Luciano Sanchez Ramos. The young man worked as a dishwasher at the restaurant and lived in the same building as Brianna. But most importantly, he was home on the morning of the murder. He arrived at work half an hour after Brianna sent her last message to her friend. When the police brought him in for questioning, he did not show much willingness to talk. Perhaps this was due to his immigration status or just a general distrust of the police. Nevertheless, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detective asked if anyone could verify his alibi, even partially. Luciano said there was someone, his colleague, the restaurant's cook Raul, who gave him a ride to work. The police spoke with Raul, who confirmed that he picked up Luciano. Raul honked his horn, and within a couple of minutes, Luciano came out of the house, behaving as usual. The investigators wanted some reliable confirmation of this and hoped that surveillance cameras might reveal what Luciano did that morning. Did he really just go to work at 11 a.m., or did he stop by the dumpster to dispose of the evidence? Unfortunately, all the restaurant's cameras filmed only inside the establishment. However, there was a gas station across from the dumpsters that had its own surveillance cameras. The quality of the footage left much to be desired, and the dumpsters were far from the gas station. Still, these videos provided invaluable help to the investigation. On May 9th, the police finally finished reviewing all the footage from the restaurant and the parking lot where the dumpsters were located. Individually, these videos were not very useful, But when the detectives correlated the timestamps, they obtained a much clearer picture of what had happened. At 1:16 p.m., one person exited through the restaurant's back door. Simultaneously, only one person approached the dumpster. It was 22-year-old restaurant cook Raul Ponce Rocha. He threw away the trash, quickly returned to the restaurant kitchen, and washed his hands. What was even more interesting was that Raul was the only one who left the restaurant during the time frame when Brianna's murder was committed. At 10:21 a.m., just a few minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived at work, he exited through the back door to go pick up Luciano and returned at 10:56 a.m. Notably, he left wearing a brown hoodie but returned without it. He confirmed that he and Luciano did not make any stops on their way back to work. The detectives asked him why he was gone for 35 minutes when the trip to pick up Luciano should have taken a maximum of 20 minutes. Where did the extra 15 minutes go? Raul was surprisingly stubborn and did not attempt to explain. The detective then asked about the cuts on his hands. Raul explained that as a cook, he frequently handled knives and had cut himself about 3 weeks ago, although the cuts looked fresh. While the investigators were confident that they had the right suspect, one question continued to trouble them. Why did Raul attack Brianna, and with such brutality? After all, he barely knew her. The Ramirez brothers had always treated him well, considering him a jovial fellow who often told funny stories and never had any quarrels with them. But detectives soon found the answer to this question. The police had enough evidence to obtain a DNA sample from Raul and a search warrant for the house where he lived with his parents and brothers. To prevent him from fleeing, they detained him based on his illegal immigration status. During the search of his bedroom, police found a glove that matched the one found in the dumpster, a sweatshirt with strands of hair that could belong to Brianna, and, finally, under the mattress, several adult videos and 4 pairs of women's panties. Everything fell into place when officers remembered Brianna's mother Lori's words about how she had taken her daughter's car to the auto repair shop that day. On the morning of May 2, 2009, Raul arrived at the restaurant around 9 a.m. On his way, he passed by the house where the girl lived and noticed that her car was not in its usual spot. He made a fatal mistake, assuming she wasn't home. Knowing that Hugo and Sebastian would soon arrive for work, he decided it was a perfect opportunity to add to his modest collection and steal something from Brianna's belongings. Just minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived for work, Raul left, got into his car, and under the pretext of picking up Luciano, headed to the girl's house. He didn't immediately signal Luciano and instead went into the apartment where the brothers and Brianna lived. The lock on the apartment door was not very secure and could easily be opened with a plastic card. He entered the apartment. If the girl had caught him in the act, Raul could have claimed he was looking for the brothers and that the door was open. But most likely, the girl caught him stealing her underwear. Realizing she could identify him, Raul panicked, first hitting her with an iron and then slashing her throat with a knife, inflicting several other wounds. Detectives speculate that he began to derive pleasure from the process. Otherwise, it's unclear why he would strike her multiple times with 2 knives. After the murder, he quickly tried to clean up and took the evidence with him, as he still needed to pick up Luciano. He then returned to work as if nothing had happened and disposed of the evidence packet. All doubts about Raul's involvement disappeared when the lab results arrived. His DNA was found on the knife, the packet, the gloves, the iron, and under Brianna's fingernails. The hair on his sweatshirt also belonged to the victim. Furthermore, a blood-stained shoe print in the bathroom matched the size and pattern of Raul's shoes that he wore on the day of the murder. Raul was charged with Brianna's murder. The trial began in 2011. Initially, during interrogations, Raul claimed he had never spoken to Brianna and never entered the house where she lived. However, by the start of the trial, his story changed. Despite almost pinning the murder on Sebastian and Hugo, Raul showed no remorse and decided to accuse an innocent third person of the crime. He claimed that he had entered the apartment but left, leaving behind his colleague Sergio Juarez Gutierrez, who Brianna was discussing something with in another room. This statement could have planted doubts in the minds of the jurors because Sergio hastily left for Mexico, and Raul's lawyers were confident they wouldn't be able to question him. However, the police managed to contact Sergio in Mexico, and he was not pleased to hear that his name had been dragged through the mud. He returned for the trial and proved that he was nowhere near Brianna on the day of the murder. Sergio had returned to Mexico shortly before the murder to take care of his father, who had cancer. No one expected Sergio to appear in court, and it was a serious blow to the defendant's defense. It took the jurors only 90 minutes to find Raul guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thus, a young woman lost her life due to a tragic mistake. Raul did not enter the apartment with the intention of killing her. But why did he choose murder instead of being charged with unlawful entry? Was he afraid of being deported? That everyone would find out about his collection? Or did he simply not realize the consequences of his actions? Did he cover Brianna's face with a towel, unable to face what he had done? Brianna's father admitted that he wanted to talk to Raul, perhaps to ask him all these questions. However, Raul declined his offer to meet. He never took responsibility for the crime. His decision was based solely on the assumption that Brianna wasn't home. After the trial, Lori Schneller said that the verdict wouldn't bring back her daughter, but would allow them to live on. "We are glad that justice was served for her," she said. "I don't know if there will ever be a day like before, but it has become a little easier after the verdict." In the morning of August 15, 1989, Wolfgang Silaf received a phone call in his office. "Mom has disappeared," he heard through the tears in the voice of Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister Birgit Meyer, who was 41 at the time. Wolfgang immediately understood that his sister couldn't have simply vanished and abandoned her daughter. Despite the fact that the girl was no longer a child, they had maintained a very close and trusting relationship with her mother. In 1989, Wolfgang was leading the criminal police department in Hamburg, however. Even such an influential person couldn't secure a thorough investigation into his sister's disappearance by the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Birgit lived. Firstly, the Lüneburg police were occupied with the investigation of 2 murders, to which they devoted all their resources. Secondly, apart from their workload, there was another reason to approach this case somewhat carelessly. They had a suspect from the very beginning, Birgit's husband Harold Meyer. The man was a successful businessman working in the printing industry. He had started dating another woman after separating from his wife a few months before Birgit's disappearance. Birgit, who was unemployed at the time of their separation, struggled with the impending divorce and occasionally sought solace in alcohol. However, on the evening of August 14, 1989, Birgit greeted her husband with a smile. Harold came to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that the woman had finally come to terms with her emotions. Birgit and Harold had a friendly discussion about the conditions of their divorce. Birgit was supposed to receive 500,000 Deutsche Marks and agreed to move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The next day, they had agreed to go to a notary. However, in the morning, Yasmin discovered her mother's disappearance. Birgit's Opel Cabriolet was parked in the garage, but there was no sign of the woman anywhere in the house. As it would later become known, her documents had also disappeared. Apart from a shoe print near Birgit's house, there were no slightest indications of a committed crime, no blood, no signs of struggle. According to Birgit's husband, the previous evening had gone smoothly, and they hadn't argued. After her husband left, Birgit had spoken on the phone with her mother and daughter and had mentioned that she and her husband didn't quarrel and that the meeting went well. However, despite Harold's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to part with his wife and avoid paying her 500,000. Today, Harold Meyer continues to live in the same house from which his wife disappeared without a trace. He remembers Birgit as always being his loyal friend whom he could fully rely on. However, many believe Harold was guilty of his wife's disappearance and later her murder. He heard constant whispers and rumors. His friends questioned whether he had taken Birgit in his Porsche and dumped her into the sea from his motorboat. Even his own daughter sometimes had a silent question in her eyes, wondering if he knew something about her mother's whereabouts, and if the police could be right in their suspicions. Only Wolfgang Silaf believed that Harold had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance because Harold and Birgit never argued about money. When Birgit met Harold the evening 32 years ago, elegantly dressed, he immediately noticed that she had had a few drinks to lift her spirits. He teased her, saying that she probably didn't plan on getting bored, and she flirtatiously replied, "Who knows?"
Now he believes that her killer was nearby at that moment, already waiting for the opportune moment to attack her. However, it was only 6 weeks after Birgit's disappearance that Harold began to have suspicions about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day of Birgit's disappearance, she had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener in a conversation. Allegedly, he had knocked on Birgit's door, introduced himself, and asked for directions to a certain house, even though he already knew the address. Harold didn't know what to think. He remembered a party in the neighboring house where the gardener was also present. A quiet and silent man, blonde with very beautiful features but a terrifying gaze. Harold recalled how he had been extremely frightened by the cold and evaluative look in his icy eyes. And now it turned out that Birgit had met him a few months before her disappearance, right after that party at the neighbor's. She had been drinking excessively, and the gardener had escorted her home. Harold reported this new acquaintance of his wife to the police. The investigators found out that the gardener, who also worked at the cemetery, was named Kurt Werner Wichmann. He was handsome but an extremely dangerous type. In his early years, he had threatened a young mother and her child with a knife, and in his youth, he abducted a hitchhiking girl, subjected her to abuse, and nearly killed her. After that incident, he spent 5.5 years in prison. Kurt Werner Wichmann, the investigators decided to personally talk to Wichmann and invited him to the police station. He showed up wearing gloves, claiming it was due to allergies. Wichmann stated that he had an alibi during the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he spent the entire evening at home and only went for a walk with his German Shepherd after 10 p.m., but it didn't take him more than 15 minutes. His words were confirmed by his wife. Wisely, Wichmann decided not to mention that he had been on sick leave on the day of Birgit's disappearance and didn't need to go to work. It wouldn't have been difficult for the police to verify this, but surprisingly, Wichmann didn't seem worthy of attention as a suspect to any of the investigators. Wolfgang noted that at the very least, a preliminary investigation should have been initiated. However, this did not happen. The brother of the missing woman constantly heard from his colleagues that they were doing everything possible but unfortunately couldn't find her. When he tried to gather more information about the case, they fell silent. Days, months, and years passed before a new prosecutor in Lüneburg took up the case. It was only in 1993, 3.5 years after Birgit's disappearance, that a criminal case was filed against Kurt Werner Wichmann on suspicion of Birgit Meyer's murder. On a cold February morning in 1993, the police knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, Kurt Werner Wichmann's home. His wife opened the door, but her husband was not at home. The police presented a search warrant and began their work. The search immediately led the officers to a recently demolished wall made of plasterboard in the basement. On the first floor, they noticed a soundproof door. Kurt's wife explained that she didn't have a key. It was only in possession of her husband and his brother. The officers forced open the door, behind which awaited a veritable arsenal, 2 small caliber rifles, a revolver, silencers, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sedatives, chains, ropes, and handcuffs with traces of blood. The police confiscated all these items. During the search of the surrounding area, a metal detector was triggered. With the help of a police excavator, they managed to dig up something extraordinary in Wichmann's garden, an entire car, a brand new bright red Ford sports coupe, on the back seat of which forensic experts found blood. The search team also detected a strong smell of decomposing flesh inside the car, but no actual body was found. Shortly thereafter, the police found a parked VW Golf near Lüneburg registered to Wichmann. Inside the car, they discovered road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars. The equipment seemed more suitable for a hunter or someone who spends a lot of time spying on people they intend to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade the authorities. However, on April 15, 1993, an accident occurred on a country road near Heilbronn. The police inspected the car, which contained 2 men. Weapons were found in the car,
so the driver was taken to the station. It was discovered that the driver was Kurt, and his younger brother was sitting next to him in the car. The police did not believe that Kurt could pose a danger to himself, so they did not confiscate his belt. The man died in his prison cell on April 25, 1993, at the age of 43. The police quickly closed the case because, according to the German Code of Criminal Procedure, the deceased should not become the subject of an investigation. However, this was far from the end of the story. Rather, it was the beginning of an investigation that would lead to the uncovering of the most horrifying crimes in the country's criminal history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was able to dedicate more attention and time to his sister's case. He gained access to the case files and was shocked. To his horror, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that was unearthed, and the basement in Kurt's house, where the search team had sensed the presence of remains, had never been thoroughly investigated. However, in Wolfgang's opinion, the evidence should have been preserved. Firstly, because there is no statute of limitations on murder cases. Secondly, the principle of not conducting an investigation against the dead is not applicable in this case because there is another suspect, Birgit Harold, the husband of Birgit Meyer. To justify or condemn Harold, all the evidence needed to be examined, the neighbors of Kurt needed to be interrogated. In short, regular police work needed to be done. But now, it was impossible to study the evidence. Nevertheless, Wolfgang decided not to give up and assembled a group of volunteers from his former colleagues. They discussed the motives, possible developments, and the behavior of the perpetrator again and again. Finally, they came up with the idea that Birgit's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved crimes. In search of confirmation of this theory, Wolfgang went to Wyman's house. The secret room had hardly changed since it was discovered in 1993. In the room, he found video recordings of 2 TV shows, one about Birgit Meyer's disappearance and the other about the murders in Gode. Wolfgang immediately informed the police in Lüneburg, and nothing happened. The cases remained unsolved for years. In 2015, the head of the criminal police department in Lüneburg was replaced. Wolfgang managed to convince him to create a commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by an experienced and meticulous specialist, Richard Kaufmann, who had solved all his cases over the past few years. He discovered that a tiny drop of blood was found on the handcuffs found in Wyman's secret room, and the sample had not been destroyed because it was stored at the Hanover Medical School laboratory. DNA comparison showed that the blood belonged to Birgit Meyer. Now, there was no doubt that Wyman had handcuffed Birgit and probably killed her. The investigator speculated that he wanted to kidnap her and demand a ransom from Harold, but something went wrong. It was evident that at least 2 people were involved in the abduction because a neighbor heard the sound of a running car engine that night. Where could Birgit's body have been? The investigator examined several graves dug in the cemetery when Wyman worked there, but Birgit Meyer was not found in them. Then Wolfgang decided to find out everything he could about the man's past. First of all, one should not imagine a spoiled boy from a wonderful family. His father used to threaten his mother with an axe and was cruel to his sons. Young Kurt Werner Wyman ended up in a social institution called Witchenstift, and after the New Year holidays in 1964, he didn't want to go back. But he needed money to escape, so the 14-year-old boy entered the apartment of his parents' tenants, a young family, with a dagger and a flashlight. The husband was at work, and only the mother and the infant were at home. The woman woke up because of the flashlight's light, screamed, and the boy lightly choked her to prevent her from screaming. Then he turned to the child, and the woman was about to believe that he would do something to her son, but fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the girl whom 22-year-old Kurt decided to give a ride to in 1970 was not so lucky. Offering a hitchhiking girl to get in his car, he took her to the forest and attacked her. After getting what he wanted, he choked the poor girl a little and threw her in the trunk, apparently planning to bury her. However,
something incredible happened. When he opened the trunk again, the girl, who had regained consciousness, managed to convince the man to let her go, pretending that he shouldn't be afraid of her. But when he read an article about the attack in the newspaper 2 days later, he realized that the events described in it were not as he perceived them. And what did he do?
He went to the police to, as he claimed, correct some facts. After adjusting the facts, the man spent 5.5 years in prison. People who knew Kirk describe him as an arrogant loner. He didn't need friends, but he had a strong need for recognition, so he was a braggart from childhood and loved things, especially cars,
that he couldn't afford. Realizing what kind of person Kurt was, Wolfgang understood that he was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist for whom it was important how he appeared in the eyes of others. The desire to control his external image was so great that he was even willing to turn himself in after committing a crime. Therefore, Wolfgang assumed that his sister Birgit Meyer's body was hidden in Wyman's house or on the premises of his house. It's sad that when he asked the police in Lüneburg to conduct a thorough search there a few years ago, they didn't listen to him. As the head of the investigation group told him, his criminal experience told him that Birgit wasn't there. While he was saying this, he was standing right above her body, with only a concrete slab separating them. When Wolfgang finally opened the concrete floor in Kurt's garage many years later, he found what was left of his sister's body. The autopsy showed that Birgit Meyer was shot in the head, just like at least one of the victims of the Hort murders and another victim of the 1968 murder. The Birgit case was solved, but Wolfgang decided not to stop there, remembering other families waiting for the crimes that affected their loved ones to be solved. Thus, thanks to Wolfgang's persistence, a crime that had terrified the entire northern part of Germany in the 90s was finally solved at the end of 2017, the murders in Gord. Gord is the vast wooded area east of Lüneburg. In July 1989, the weather in northern Germany was sunny and hot, prompting many people to seek refuge from the summer heat in the cool shade of the forest. On July 12, 1989, 2 days before Birgit's disappearance, 3 people who were picking blueberries in Gord suddenly smelled a nauseating sweet odor. Trying to find the source of the smell, they discovered a human hand under a pine tree among the branches. It turned out that on May 21, 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reinhold, went on a picnic in the forest, intending to spend a pleasant time in the fresh air. They were brutally murdered, and their bodies were dragged away from the scene of the attack. When they were discovered, the husband and wife were almost naked, but it was unclear whether the perpetrator had undressed them or if they had undressed themselves before the attack. The killer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and the keys to their car, which he used to escape. The car was later found in another city. The disappearance of the couple was reported, but they could not be found for 7 weeks. Due to the heat, very little remained of their bodies, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. However, robbery was ruled out as the motive because valuable items were still found on the victims. Since there were no mobile phones at the time, the people picking berries hurried to the forest ranger to inform him of the horrifying discovery so that he could report it to the police. However, it was not just the bodies themselves that terrified the Germans, who nicknamed Gord the Dead Forest. The unique fact in modern criminal history in Germany was that while the police were still examining Peter and Ursula's bodies, the killer claimed the lives of another couple located just 800 meters away from the investigators. On July 12, 1989, Ingrid Warmbier, 46, and Bernd Michael Kopping, 43, from Hanover, arrived in Gord. They were spouses but not with each other, which is why they chose this forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers into the forest. They were brutally killed, sound of a gunshot, and then the killer took their Polaroid camera and the keys to their car, with which he fled. It was later determined that he drove the car for about a week before abandoning it. The bodies were discovered by chance only 2 weeks later when the police were searching the area due to the first 2 murders. The crime scenes were only 800 meters apart, but subsequent tests showed that the police working on the first murder could not hear the gunshots due to the locations of the crime scenes in the depressions. Given the new discovery, the random encounter of the berry pickers became of great importance. As they hurried to the forest ranger to report the horrifying find, they encountered a man. Of course, 2 weeks later, their description of the person would be quite vague. But they remembered that they had encountered a tall and strong 40-year-old brunette with medium-length hair, without glasses or a beard. He was carrying a bag that was clearly not empty. Based on the witnesses' accounts, a composite sketch was created even if this man might not have had any connection to the crime. The common factor in these murders was that they were committed in the same area of a vast forest. Additionally, the victims were both of middle age. In 2 cases, the perpetrator stole the victim's belongings, although it was not a typical robbery. He would leave the crime scenes in the victims' cars and then abandon the vehicles in small towns with railway connections. Both towns were located along the Hanover-Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to speculate that the same person was responsible for the crimes. In 1989, Kurt Werner Weimann was 40 years old and lived 30 kilometers away from Gord. On the day of the secret lover's murder, he was on sick leave. The spouses were also killed on a Sunday when Kurt didn't have to go to work. However, the investigators initially found no evidence linking Weimann to the crimes in Gord. Furthermore, he did not resemble the composite sketch. Therefore, the police focused on other suspects, suspecting that the deceived husband of the second victim had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover but accidentally targeted the wrong person before carrying out the hit. Once again, Wolfgang couldn't understand the investigators' decision. He and his group of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt matched the profile of the Gord killer. The brutality of the crimes and the intimate aspects, as evidenced by the victim's exposed clothing, all aligned with Weimann's profile. Moreover, years ago, Wolfgang found a videotape of the TV program Oktenzeichen Sei, which covered the Gord murders, in Kurt's secret room. Being a narcissist, Kurt also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Berdith Meyer. There were also pieces of evidence showing that the man sought information about Bernd Michael Kopping, who was killed in Gord. However, as often happens today, the DNA analysis provided the final piece of evidence. The Gord killer had a habit of driving the victims' cars for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological materials were found. However, it took nearly 30 years before the DNA in the car was compared to Kurt's DNA. Only at the end of 2017 did the analysis yield a match. Kurt Werner Weimann was the perpetrator of the 2 murders in Gord.